After re-watching every single one of the Iron Man movies, thanks to being commissioned by this legend here, I ended up getting inspiration for this entire 2-hour what if movie of what if Deku was Iron Man. And honestly speaking, I really think that I did so much justice to the character, the narrative, the story. There's so many cool moments in this video that I guarantee you're bound to like at least some sections of this. And considering the fact that I'm covering possibly one of the MCU's most beloved characters in Tony Stark, aka Iron Man, I just had to do justice to this guy. That said, if you end up making it to the end of the video, or you simply just want to support your boy because you know I gotta eat, then please leave a like on the video and enjoy. We begin our story on the day of Izuku's birth, with Izuku being born with brown hair and blue eyes. As Deku would come out into the world, he would be seen by a small girl and a man with similar features to his own. It'd be in this moment that we would go on to see the birth certificate of Izuku. We zoom in on that, and it would end up saying the name Izuku Shield, similarly to his father, David Shield, who in this timeline is gonna be the father of Izuku. Now, unfortunately, that does mean that his mom isn't gonna be Inko in this timeline, but it is what it is. She ends up having a daughter in this timeline, let's say, instead of Izuku, and she's also born quirkless, so she just doesn't really want to become a hero. Instead, she opts to do something else. Who cares? Regardless though, in this specific timeline, the reason that I figured David Shield would be an incredible father for Izuku is just because we're going to be following the whole Iron Man story. Not in the sense of the actual stuff that happens in his life, but more specifically him being, rich and having access to all of these gadgets that he's able to use and the intelligent mind or whatever. So yeah, Deku in this timeline is going to be the son of David Shield and have a sister named Melissa, who in this timeline are both going to be massive helps to Izuku's journey, because A, being the son of David is going to be granting him access to a lot of technology, and B, being the son of David Shield is going to be giving him an advantage that no other quirkless kid has. Now obviously, if I was to have made Izuku Inko's son, he definitely would have had to go on about his journey of becoming Iron Man in a more broke type approach, in the sense that he wouldn't have had access to things. But here, he does, and that's going to be working to his benefit as a child. We're going to pretty much end up skipping to when Deku's 4 years old, and it'd be on this day that Izuku would make his way to the Quirk Doctor. He, Melissa, and David would all be on their way there, with the exception of his mother, because I like to think that she probably passed or something like that, and that's the reason that we're never introduced to David's wife. But regardless, they would arrive to the Quirk Doctor, and once they do so, they would end up finding out that Izuku is quirkless. Now, obviously in the original timeline of the story, Deku, when he finds this out, is just broken. Like his mom tells him, "I'm sorry, Izuku," and we get the whole usual scene in the original. It'd be at this moment that Melissa, looking towards her brother, would hug him, saying that it's gonna be okay. And Izuku would start crying, thinking that his dream is over. But there would be a glint in David's eyes as he would look at his son and then look at Melissa and remember what happened with her. She tried becoming a hero after finding out she was quirkless, but ultimately just gave up. But he doesn't want that to be the case for his son. Knowing the dangers of being a hero, he still knows that that's all his son dreams about, day and night. All Might is the only thing going through Izuku's head. He loves watching hero videos. He loves the thought of rescuing people with a smile on his face. And David was not willing to take that dream from his son. So, getting down to eye level with Izuku, he would look at him and hug him, telling him, "Son, you can still be a hero. In fact, you could be a hero to all quirkless people around, showing them that just because you're quirkless, that doesn't mean that you're helpless." Izuku, hearing that from his father, would look at him as he would smile, telling him, "You're right, Dad." And so, we would get a brief time skip in which during this time, Izuku and Melissa would both grow up, with Izuku watching her and having the advantage of being the little brother. He would learn from her mistakes, he would see a lot of things that Melissa didn't get to see, and having David as his father would actually end up helping him in the lab. Izuku, by the age of 10 years old, would be a mini genius, and at that point in the story, Izuku would already begin studying ways of becoming a hero, deciding that if he doesn't have a quirk, well then he'll just have to use the next best thing. Support items, because in Izuku's head, using a support item will probably be helping him just as much as having a quirk. In fact, it could help him more. A person who only has a fire quirk will only rely on that specifically, but if Izuku has gadgets that could shoot fire, ice, or wind, or poison, or explosives, then Izuku's already going to be a very versatile hero. And so, as a little kid, Izuku would develop these little weapons for himself that ultimately would be powerful. Some of them would blow up in his face, and others, well, they just wouldn't really work. And honestly enough, if Izuku was to have the help of his father at this point, he'd probably already have a Mark 1 suit ready. But unfortunately for him, he doesn't even want his dad's help. He genuinely wants to become a hero all on his own. And that would be something that impresses David and Melissa both, because both of them know that they could help Izuku, and all three of them working together could possibly create one of the greatest suits ever for Izuku to use so much technology, similarly to what ends up happening with All Might's whole little armored All Might suit. But over the course of these years, Deku would work on new prototypes, little propeller boots, and energy blasters from his hand. He also has flamethrowers on them that he would have added, and maybe even some sort of smoke box, which essentially works just like his quirk smoke screen, and things of the nature. Essentially, over the course of these years, we would see Izuku grow, and as he would grow, he would develop more and more technology, getting smarter and smarter as the years would progress. Now, obviously, Deku's trying to create this suit, and as the years go by, it would get slimmer and slimmer, because technology doesn't exactly offer you the benefit of being super compact and small. That's something that Izuku would have had to learn and perfect over the years. So his first suit would be this big, super giant, clunky, almost looking like the Hulkbuster armor that Izuku would create for himself, but knowing that this thing's too big, Deku would create more and more versions of it until finally he created a streamlined, skinnier version of it, which is more similar to the Mark II suit. Which means that ultimately it's going to be extremely powerful, but it's also going to be having its drawbacks, similar to the ones that Iron Man would have seen when he would have made his own suits. But regardless, after time would have passed and Deku's childhood would finally be over, Deku would now be ready to take the UA entrance exam. And funny enough, the trajectory Deku's life would have actually led him down in this timeline would be kind of an interesting one, because in this timeline, there's no Bakugo to sit there bullying him relentlessly over the fact that he doesn't have a quirk, and he's the son of David's shield, which means that people respect him and definitely aren't going to be bullying him like in the original. But there definitely will be a few people who would make comments about Deku being quirkless and how he must feel bad. That's stuff that Deku would still be used to hearing, with people always doubting him because of the mere fact that he was quirkless. Deku would secretly hate that, not really bringing it out to light, but it would be something that he shrugs off outwardly, but genuinely would eat him alive whenever he starts to think about it. So Deku would be kind of an interesting character at this point. He's similarly to Tony Stark, but he still has the immaturity of being a young man, because I mean, the dude is 14. But when it comes to the brain that he has, Izuku might as well have some sort of crazy IQ quirk, because it's absolutely diabolical how smart he is. That said, as the week would approach for the UA entrance exam would come around, Deku would find himself in his new apartment that David would have rented out for him, with a lab and a big old bathroom and a big old living room. It's pretty much just a really, really nice penthouse type apartment that has a super sick lab for Deku to use. And as he would be sitting there, Deku would be tinkering with some new inventions that he's potentially creating for his suit, and all the while that would be happening, Deku would be staring at the armored suit that he would have created after so many years of trial and error and going back to the drawing board and trying to restart over and over and over again. Deku couldn't even remember how many failed suits he had had to this point. At this point, obviously the suit itself looks like Mark II, but the actual number that it would probably be like Mark 200 and something, because Deku's been trying to make this suit ever since he was like 4 years old, which is kind of insane. But with so many trial and error failure moments, Deku definitely would have gotten the suit to the point where it is now all on his own, without the help of his genius inventor father. So as Izuku would stare at the suit, a little smile would appear on his face as Izuku would continue tinkering with his creations, simply thinking, I can't wait to show the world what a quirkless kid can do. And so we would finally find ourselves with Izuku standing face to face with the walls of UA. Deku, seeing this, would smile as he would walk inside holding his backpack, head held high, when suddenly a blonde-haired boy would actually bump into him, causing Deku to lose his balance as he would go on to actually start falling, when all of a sudden a brown-haired girl would touch him with her quirk, being Uraraka, and she would save him from falling, having a little bit of a bad luck type start to the test. He, looking up at her, would say, "Whoa, did you just save me with your quirk?" She, looking at him, would say, "Yeah, sorry, I didn't really have enough time to ask you, you were already falling." Izuku would look at her, thanking her, as he would start to freak out, being like, "Whoa, you have such an incredible quirk." He would start talking about how awesome it is to have an anti-gravity quirk, and she would just start blushing, saying, "Oh, stop it, it's not that cool." Deku would tell her that he knows she's gonna be an incredible hero someday, and she would start blushing at this as Deku would smile and say good luck on the test. And so, the both of them making their way inside would sit down as President Mike would begin to explain the rules to everybody. With this happening, I don't see Ida calling Deku out in this timeline because he's not going to be a chatterbox, and instead, we're able to just jump straight into the robot section of the exam. Deku, waiting towards the back of the line, would notice a really nervous looking girl towards the front, and Deku, remembering who that was on the outside, knowing that before this she had helped him, Deku would think to himself that he should help her. So, while wearing his Iron Man suit, which would be in an all silver color, Deku would make his way towards her as a boy with blue hair gets up close to him and tells him, "Hey, what are you doing? Are you trying to distract that girl? We're all here trying to become heroes and we don't need you getting in our way." Izuku, hearing this, would turn towards Ida saying, "No, I was actually going over to try to help her out," as Ida would start karate chopping the air, essentially telling Izuku that he needs to focus on his own test. With that being said, as they would be talking about things, President Mike would go on the inner speaker saying, "Go, go, go! There's no countdowns in a real battle," as everybody would fly off, and Izuku, seeing this, would be like, "Oh dang, I'm late." Izuku would then say, "Jarvis, thrusters on," as these little thrusters would turn on and Deku would begin flying into the air. Deku would say, "Woohoo!" flying, as he makes his way to the very top of everything, overlooking the entire area of the test, as Izuku would say, "Jarvis, what's the best route I could take at the moment?" With Jarvis speaking, as she would say, "Hello, sir," before explaining to Izuku and using like the tracking technology that he has in his suit to pinpoint the best path to destroy the robots and also simultaneously stay out of people's way, so this is not becoming a conflict of interest. It'd be at this point that Izuku would smile as he would be proud of the suit that he created. It'd be at this moment that we would get a slight little flashback of Izuku with David and Melissa actually giving Izuku a briefcase. Inside of it would be Mark something, like 200 something pretty much, the one that they would design for him. Using the blueprints of his own designs, they would have actually created an upgraded version of his own suit, and they would have given it to Izuku, wanting him to use it, pretty much telling him how proud of him they are and how they're so glad that he never gave up on his dream of being a hero, telling Izuku that they want him to succeed in the test and show everybody what a quirkless kid can do. This being said, Deku would accept the suit because it came from his family, because of course he's not going to deny it, and plus it honestly was a lot better of an upgrade from the suit that he had created. But Izuku didn't want to use theirs. He genuinely wanted to prove that all his hard work was paying off, so he went into the test wearing his own Mark II suit, and doing so, Deku would end up getting a remarkable score of 63 robot points with 6 minutes having passed. Deku at this point would fly up into the air, asking Jarvis for any more robots that he could take out, and it'd be at this point that she would begin scanning a couple of more, with Izuku saying, "Let's take him out." He would fly down there using his thrusters and his hand blasters to shoot beams of energy towards the robots, which ultimately blow them up. Deku would then fly at a 3-pointer as he would fly straight through it, breaking its arms off and flying up into the air. Deku would be having the time of his life, considering that these robots are a lot better target practice than the ones that he actually uses at home. So with that being said, as Deku's having the time of his life using his quirked suit, Deku would fly up into the air and Jarvis would say, "Sir, there appears to be someone in danger." Deku, at hearing that, would say, "Where?" as he would zoom into an image of Uraraka being crushed under rubble and the 0-pointer. Deku, seeing that, knowing that he couldn't just stand by and let her be hurt, he would fly towards her direction as Jarvis would say, "Sir, at the current pace you're moving at, once you arrive there, you will end up having to fight the 0-pointer. But Izuku would simply smile, saying that's what he's planning on doing. And so, arriving to her, he would throw the rubble up off of her, as taking her by her hips, Deku would hold her tight as they would fly up into the air, and Izuku, looking at Uraraka, would say, "Hey again," with Uraraka kind of sitting there in confusion, considering that she doesn't recognize Izuku, because in his suit there's actually a voice changer. But as this would be happening and Izuku's flying up in the air with her, a rocket out of his back would shoot towards the direction of the 0-pointer, blowing its head up, causing a chain reaction with the 0-pointer exploding. It'd be in this moment that Deku would fly her towards the direction of Recovery Girl, and once that would be over, the test would conclude, as Deku would smile and wave at her and fly off towards his house. With that being the case, Deku would land it on the top of his apartment, making his way down the stairs, as Izuku would end up saying, "Jarvis, did you record all that?" And you would pretty much just hear Jarvis saying, "I did, sir. Would you like to play it back?" Izuku would say, "Yeah, cast it onto my laptop," with Izuku immediately jumping onto his couch with his suit on. Like, mind you, it's dirty and full of rubble because he would have just fought robots, but he's just kind of sitting there with his little 90-inch flat screen just watching everything that he would have done. Deku in that moment would be throwing like air punches and kicks and stuff, being like, "I was so cool." And mind you, Deku's like just very excited, like new to this hero. He thinks that all of this is so cool, and so watching this video, he would end up having a video call from Melissa and David, with them both pretty much asking Izuku how things would have went. Deku would be so excited, telling them that it was awesome. He used the suit to do exactly what he had always envisioned. It was no longer those dumb little testing dummies that stood still, but it was real robots. He would tell David that he's going to be a great hero and he knows he will, going on to explain that he got a ton of robot points, as David would smile, telling Izuku that he knew he would do well, with him asking how the suit was. Deku at this point would rub the back of his head, going on to explain that really he used his own suit, saying that he wanted to see how his own suit would fare in this moment, knowing that their suit was a little better than his. David would let out a laugh, with Melissa saying, "Izuku, we knew you would do that, but we want to see how the video came out. We know Jarvis recorded it." Izuku would say, "Oh, sure, I'll show you," as he would literally start screen sharing everything that he would have done, and both of them would be very impressed, with David saying that the suit functioned just like he expected, in fact, a little better. He would ask Izuku if he made a couple upgrades in the time that he was there, and Izuku would nod, saying that he did make a couple. It'd be at this point that David and Melissa would both smile at Izuku, as Melissa would say, "Hey, I just want you to know, I'm so proud of you. You did what me and Papa have always wanted to do, and you didn't give up, even when you were told you were quirkless. You're honestly an inspiration to me, even though you're my little brother. And I want you to promise me something, Izuku." Izuku would say, what is it?" And she would say, "Promise that you'll never give up on being a hero, no matter what people say to you, and no matter what challenges you face. Never give up." Deku, hearing that, would smile as he would say, "I promise." And so the call would end. It'd be at this point that Deku, sitting there tinkering with the stuff, would get a little bored as he realizes that he wants to use his suit again. And knowing that he couldn't exactly just fly out into the city and do his own hero work, or else he would probably get arrested, Deku would decide that he was going to be making his way towards the junkyard, opting to pretty much go find some scrap metal which he could use to actually do some dummy tests in his lab. So Deku, getting his things together and getting his e-bike, would end up making his way towards that direction, as he would have like a really big container cart thing behind him that he would have created. And Izuku making his way there, he would end up arriving at the junkyard as he would start scoping through everything that was there, seeing fridges and like little prototypes of robots. He would also see scrap metal parts of cars and stuff, the usual stuff you would expect. And as he would be there, Deku would actually end up seeing that there was another girl there with pink hair. Deku, getting close to her, would say, "Hey, what's up?" As she would look at him and say, "Oh, there's somebody else here looking for scrap." She would ask Izuku what he's in the market for, as Izuku would go on to say that right now he really just wants to find some scrap metals he can use for target practice. Mei, hearing this, would say, "Oh, you're in the market for that. What quirk do you got?" With Izuku saying, "I don't really have a quirk. I actually use my..." But before he could even finish his sentence, she would say, "You use your support items." As Izuku would say, "That's exactly right." And she would say, "Can I see them? Can I? Izuku would smile as he would say, "Sure, if you can help me take all this stuff back to my lab." She would say, "You have a lab?" And she would then pretty much get so excited that she's like, "Now I gotta see it." She starts helping Izuku pack everything up using some of her babies, like some arms that she would have created similar to Doc Ock's. It's like two mechanical arms that she can use to pick heavy stuff up. As Izuku would be impressed with her creations, he'd be like, "Whoa, you made those?" And she would say, "Yup, they're my babies, number da-da-da-da-da-da." And Izuku, hearing that, would say, "Oh, you name your creations too?" She would say, "Yup." As the both of them, grabbing all their stuff, would finally make their way towards Izuku's lab. Once they would end up arriving there, Deku would click a button as a bookshelf would move and it would reveal his secret lab. They would take in all the stuff as Izuku would make his way towards his target practice area, setting it all up as Mei Hatsume would be looking around the lab being like, "Whoa, you have this and this and this?" And then she'd be like, "You have a suit!" She would go on to ask what exactly the suit actually has, how it works, what's powering it, yada yada yada, and Deku would be answering all of her questions one at a time. She would be so excited as she was asked if she could put it on, with Izuku saying that the suit was actually tailor-made to all of her measurements, but she could probably use the gauntlet. Setting up some of the scrap metal, she would tell her to fire, as holding her hand out, she would go doom, boom, and the beam would blast towards the direction of the fridge, melting a hole right through it. It'd be at that point that Melissa would say, "That's so awesome. Mind if I make some modifications to this?" As she takes the literal gauntlet itself and starts like messing with it, adding something else. She would create a power limiter, which essentially decides whether it can hit a human or an actual like dangerous villain or metal objects, which all varies in terms of how much power is actually shot out. Funny enough, Deku was also thinking about doing that. He was gonna be doing that this week, but he'd be stunned that Melissa was even able to do that as well. He would ask her what gave her that idea, as she would say, "Oh, it was simple. Seeing how much destruction you caused with that thing made me think that you couldn't exactly use this against real people. After all, you might have actually killed someone." Deku hearing that would say, "Yeah, you're right about that, but it's a good thing I only had to use that against robots." As Mei hearing that would smile and start tinkering with more gadgets. It'd be at this point that she would create something out of nothing, with Izuku being stunned. He'd be like, "Whoa, you are a crazy inventor." She would say, "Yep, I plan to be the best someday. In fact, I'm actually probably going to your school." She would say, "You're going to UA, right?" As Izuku looking at her would say, "Yeah, I am. What about you?" She would say, "Yeah, I'm going to UA too, but not to be a hero. I want to be one of the greatest support item creators ever, just like David's shield." Izuku looking at her would say, "Oh, like my dad?" With Melissa saying, "What? He's your father?" And Izuku would say, "Yeah, he is my dad." She would start freaking out, saying, "Oh wow, I can't believe that I'm in the presence of one of his labs. This is his lab after all, right? You're just using it." Izuku hearing that would say, "No, it's my lab." And she just starts yapping and yapping and yapping, as over the course of the next week, Deku just couldn't get rid of her. She was always there in his lab, making some new creations, blowing it up, making just absolute havoc. But interestingly enough, Deku would actually love having her around because there was never a dull moment with her there. They would sit there in the lab tinkering with different objects and just making new and little improvements to the suit that he had already had, the one that he had created, making different little things added to the suit, which would actually end up making it a lot stronger. But the main thing that it was actually lacking was durability, considering the fact that it was very good at taking blunt attacks, but not very good at taking like launched attacks from projectiles or quirks or things of that sort. An explosion, for instance, would definitely cause major impact. But regardless of that, eventually the week would be over and Deku would finally get his acceptance letter, with him making his way to UA and arriving for his very first day. Deku standing in front of the front door would sigh as he would walk inside and end up being greeted to that same blue-haired boy. Deku seeing him would think, "It's him," as he would then see another boy just yapping, talking about he's gonna kill everyone and they're all extras, and Deku would think that he's one of those kind of guys. He would sit near the back of the classroom, and as time would pass, finally, a girl with a pink backpack would walk in, as Izuku seeing her would know that that's Uraraka. He would say, "Oh, it's you. I knew you'd make it into this class." As Uraraka seeing him would say, "Oh, you, green-haired boy, you fell, right?" As Izuku would say, "She probably didn't recognize me." Izuku would try to like fake his voice to make it sound like the Iron Man would, and she would say, "Oh, you're the guy who saved me. Sorry, I guess I didn't recognize you out of that armor." As Izuku would smile, saying that it's fine, that he didn't expect as much, with Uraraka thanking him for saving her back there, and Izuku saying he was honestly just paying her back for what she did for him when he walked into the school, saying that he was being really clumsy that day. She would laugh, and as Izuku and her would speak, you would just see Aizawa stand up as he would go on to say, "If you're just here to make friends, you can leave. We have 3 years to mold you into the perfect hero, so put these on and meet me outside." After he would say that, the class would say, "But what about orientation?" To which Aizawa would say, "In UA, I can run my class however I want. Now put these on and meet me outside." After that would happen, everybody would make their way outside, and much like in the original, tossing the ball to the highest scoring student during the mock exam, he would throw a ball towards Izuku, who in this moment didn't actually have his quirk armor on. Deku holding it would ask, "What's this about?" as Aizawa would go on to explain to him to throw it as far as he can. At this point, Deku would reel his arm back and throw it as far as he could, getting, a half decent scores, with the class seeing them going, what are we doing? Are we just taking a physical exam? With Aizawa saying, "Not quite. During this exam, you're all going to be using your quirk so I can gauge what your potential is going to be and where you're at as it stands." He would then end up telling them that anybody who isn't deemed worthy by him to be a hero will be expelled, as he would then look towards Izuku, telling him to throw the ball once again, however this time to use his quirk. Really, he wouldn't have been doing this because he doesn't know he's quirkless, but so he could tell everybody or pretty much expose Izuku. It'd be at this point that Izuku catching the ball would say, "I'm quirkless," and everybody hearing this would be shocked, including Uraraka, but a person hearing this would actually get pissed. Bakugo. He'd say, "Huh? You mean to tell me UA let in some quirkless bastard? 2% acceptance rate, my butt. If he was allowed to get in, then it's not really that big of a deal that the rest of us are here. I didn't know UA lowered its standards so much just for quirkless people. As it'd be at this point that Deku hearing that would feel kinda bad, but he would just, hide it with a smile. As looking to Aizawa, he would simply say that he'll try not to disappoint. He would take the ball, throwing it even harder this time, getting maybe a meter more, maybe 2, and showing the classroom, Aizawa would end up saying that his score was pretty average. It'd be at this point that the rest of the test would be taken, and Izuku would be giving it his all on everything. So he would do a little bit better than he does in the original, but ultimately, Deku would still end up getting last place in comparison to all of his classmates. With that being said, and Izuku knowing that he was last and was probably going to be expelled, he would begin to get worried as he would go on to explain to Aizawa that what happened today wasn't a true estimate of what he can actually do, saying that his power is fully reliant on, with Aizawa finishing his sentence, the armor of yours. Right. What do you think's gonna happen in the real world if you don't have access to the armor, or it malfunctions, or it's simply not enough to defeat the villain? Izuku hearing this would look at Aizawa, telling him that could happen for anybody here, saying that anybody here can go up against a villain that their quirk won't be helping against, and any single one of them could find themselves useless in a plethora of situations. He would go on to say that his armor, if anything, is more than prepared for any situation. As turning towards Aizawa, he would say, if you believe that I'm not worthy of being in this hero course, then fine. Expel me. But you won't get to do that before I get the chance to show off what I can really do. Aizawa at this point would smile, looking at Izuku, testing to see his resolve, as he would say, and what are you gonna do to show me what you can do? As Izuku, looking at Aizawa straight in the eyes with zero hesitation, would say, I'll take you head on, Aizawa, and I'll prove that I could even defeat a pro hero without a quirk. I'm gonna be the first quirkless hero that there ever has been, and I'm not only gonna be bringing hope to quirked people around the world, but every quirkless kid out there who dreams of being a hero. I'm gonna prove that it is possible to be a hero without a quirk, and that all starts today. So unless you're willing to admit that you're wrong about me, then you'll fight me head on in front of the entire class, and I'll show everybody that I can hang with the best of them. Aizawa in this moment would stare back at Deku as he would say, this kid. Aizawa in this moment would have a dumb little grin on his face as looking towards Izuku he would say, there's no need for that. I was testing your grit. I wanted to be sure that if you were going to be in my class you could hang with the best of them. And challenging your teacher, well that might not have been the best approach. You've definitely showed me that you're not scared of the moment. Apart from this moment, every single one of you is going to be part of Class 1A. So be ready, because this course is going to be putting you through the most harshest conditions ever. And if you're not prepared to handle that, well then you might as well quit now. It'd be at this point that he would say class dismissed, and everybody walking away would end up basically going towards Izuku as they would all be shocked with Mineta saying, dude, you challenged our teacher. How do you even have the balls to do that? People going up to Izuku would say, you made it here with being quirkless? That's incredible. They would start praising him. Momo would say that he must be incredibly talented in order to have made it this far, saying that he probably uses some sort of support gear items, right? Izuku would nod, saying that he does, with Araka saying that she saw it. He was able to defeat a zero-pointer. People hearing that would start glazing Deku, and Bakugo would simply stare at Izuku with glare in his eyes, with Deku meeting his gaze, and both of them staring at each other. It'd be in this moment that both of them would kind of like have a stare-off moment, with them each kind of turning away, and Bakugo walking off angrily thinking that he can't wait to show that that kid doesn't belong here. But until then, Izuku and the rest of the class would continue talking as Deku, making his way back to the lab, would end up telling his father about everything that went down, minus the part with Aizawa testing him, deciding that telling his father that wasn't going to be helping anybody. So the next day would come around, and once this would happen, we would end up getting a scene of everybody in class having a normal school day, with Izuku this time walking around with his very own costume. The mark, honestly, I forgot. I don't even know at this point. But regardless, with this being the case, eventually the final class would come around and we would be greeted to seeing All Might going, I am here, walking in through the door like a normal person. Everybody would say, it's All Might, and Izuku would lose it, because mind you, in this timeline, even though he knows All Might and that's like his uncle, He had no idea that All Might was going to be a teacher at UA. So Izuku, seeing this, would smile, saying, "Uncle All Might," as All Might, looking towards Izuku, would say, "Ah, if it isn't Izuku, I knew you made it into the hero course, but you've gotten so much bigger." He would hold Izuku up as he would tell him that he's proud of him making it to UA, telling him that he can't wait to see what things that Izuku ends up doing in the school. As Bakugo, seeing that and realizing that he's connected to the #1 hero, would think, he only made it to the school because he has some pull at UA. Can't wait to knock him down a peg or two. As after this, we would get a scene of the class pretty much walking around with them all being told about the fact that they need to suit up with their hero costumes. The entire class would obviously do so, and we would end up getting the whole scene where all the students are being told about the combat training. They would then be briefed about how it's going to work, as it consists of 2v2 battles with the hero team and the villain team, and the goal is to essentially capture your targets or prevent your enemies from trying to actually get to the bomb. After explaining this, everybody would begin drawing lots, as Izuku would once again be paired up with Uraraka and face off against Tenya Ida and Katsuki Bakugo. With that being the case, Deku would look at the opponent that he's going to face off against, and he would smile underneath his armor. Deku would think that he can't wait to prove everybody that he really can hang with them, especially him, who thinks that he doesn't belong. He's going to be proving that he does. As the match would begin, Deku and Uraraka would start things off, with Izuku having his own little goal of proving that he's much stronger than Bakugo. It'd be at this point that Uraraka and himself, making their way inside of the building, would end up going up 2 stairs, as eventually the two of them would hear explosions coming down the hallway. Deku, having already studied his classmates, taking the time yesterday to have actually broke down their quirks in order to, deduce weaknesses to them, would have known this would have been Bakugo's approach. As Bakugo coming in with the big old right hook, Deku would dodge out of the way, grabbing his arm with his Iron Man suit and shooting a propulsor blast as he would shoot it straight into Bakugo's stomach. Bakugo would be sent crashing into the wall, as Bakugo with an angry expression would leap back at Deku, blasting him with the point blank blast in his face. This would scuff up the armored suit, as a red notification would appear saying, "Sir, you have taken a massive impact to the helmet," with Izuku saying, "Jarvis, get out of my way, get out of my face," as the screen would disappear, and Deku would then be greeted to another explosion by Bakugo, sending him crashing into a wall. It'd be at this point that Deku, getting up, would end up then punching towards the direction of Bakugo, who tries to fly at him and throw more explosions, but he would have ended up being caught by Bakugo, who would tell him that he's nothing but a quirkless loser. To which Deku would smile, as his suit would then start shooting out a ton of smoke in the area. Bakugo, seeing this, would say, "Huh? Your whole goal is to hide yourself? Pfft, I knew you were pathetic. You can't even fight me like a man." But it'd be in this moment that a beam would end up lighting up in the hallway, as it would shoot an energy beam towards the direction of Bakugo. But it wouldn't actually be one. It was just a flashlight that Deku had turned on. Bakugo, thinking that that was the real deal, would dodge out of the way, as he would move closer towards Izuku, who ends up starting to squeeze him with his armored suit. He would begin to squeeze Bakugo as hard as he possibly can, with Bakugo going, "Get the heck off of me!" He would start shooting explosions, going, "Die!" Similarly to when he was stuck in the sludge villain, or actually, would he even be stuck in the sludge villain? Because I think All Might, let's say that Bakugo does get stuck in the sludge villain. It still happens because All Might still drops the bottle. But regardless, with that being the case, Bakugo would eventually be able to break out, using enough explosions to cause his suit to actually malfunction. This would then lead Bakugo to telling Izuku that he's worthless, as he would throw explosion after explosion at Deku, with Deku getting pissed and shooting his beams at the direction of Bakugo. It'd be in this moment that Bakugo, being sent flying and having some scuff marks and scorch marks from the blast, would end up getting pissed at Deku. He would lunge towards him, telling him, "Die!" As Izuku would throw an uppercut punch at Bakugo, he would end up hitting him, sending him flying up into the roof, with Bakugo being pissed that he could even hit him. Mind you, the reason for this is because the suit gives him incredible strength, speed, and durability. Durability being like the weakest of the category, but speed, whoo, it definitely gives him that. He has propulsor similar to what Ingenium has on the back of its arms, which lead him to drop some devastating punches. That thing definitely would have broken a tooth or two in Bakugo's mouth, but after being sent flying and spitting them out, he would smile, blood coming out of his face, as he would tell Izuku that if he wants to be a hero so bad, then he'll show him what it's like to face a real villain. As he would then get up close and personal, pulling the pin of one of his arm gauntlets and blasting it point blank at Deku's face. It'd be at this point that Deku, from his chest would end up shooting a beam of laser at Bakugo, which simultaneously would send him crashing into the wall, knocking him down a couple seconds, with Izuku's helmet being completely destroyed almost, and a part of Deku's face showing, similarly to what Bakugo would have done to his mask in the original. That said, the two of them getting up, about to ambush each of them and go right back at it since they're both like clearly don't like each other, we would then see All Might screaming over the intercom, "Stop this fight! Stop this!" But, you know, obviously they didn't hear him and Bakugo didn't listen to him. He would have been like, "Don't do it, Bakugo!" But Bakugo would have been like, "He'll be fine if he dodges." We would then end up getting a scene of All Might rushing into the building and stopping both of them from fighting each other, saying, "This match is over," in a serious tone. After this would happen, Deku would be taken to the nurse's office alongside Bakugo, and we would simply get a scene of All Might telling Deku, "What were you thinking taking things that far? Izuku, I never pegged you to be this type of person." As Izuku would tell him that he's sorry, but that kid is so infuriating. He told him he doesn't belong to be here. He tried to act as though he was better than him, and he just kept insulting him for being quirkless. It's infuriating. He would say, "All Might, do you know what it's like to be told that you're not good enough all your life? And finally, when you show that you can hang with the best, people are still doubting you. It's infuriating." He would look at All Might as he would slam his fist on the wall, telling All Might that he wouldn't understand. As All Might, through gritted teeth, would end up wanting to tell Izuku the truth, but he just couldn't. He would tell him that he might not understand, but that still gives him no excuse to almost kill a student. Izuku would say that he wasn't trying to kill him, with him telling Izuku that that blast that he would have shot him would have done major damage to Bakugo, with Izuku saying he nearly did the same to me. Look at me. All Might would say that he understands. Both of them hurt each other gravely, but he would then go on to tell Izuku that he's not allowed to use that much force against a student again. Izuku would grit his teeth as he would sit there in the medical bed and he would just watch as All Might would leave the room. Deku would be pissed, you know, just kind of punching at the air, thinking to himself that that's not fair. But regardless, the main thing that bothered him would be that his suit was practically destroyed. That version is never going to be worn. So now, for the remainder of the story, Deku's now going to be wearing the suit that Melissa and David would have made for him. Obviously, he would have added his own modifications to it at this point and decided that this one was going to be having a splash of color. Now, you guys can imagine it to be whatever you want, whether you think that it would be like a green and silver type costume, or you want it to be the original Iron Man suit, which is red and yellow. Which, speaking of Iron Man suit, did y'all peep the fire art for the thumbnail? It's actually heat. And I just gotta know what you guys think about it. Let me know down below in the comments what you would rate that thing, because I genuinely just want to know what you guys think. I mean, like, it cost me money to make, so like, I'm over here seeking some validation to prove that it was worth it instead of just using some normal Iron Man PNG, but that's besides the point. Sitting in Deku's room, he would think back to the battle, as he would remember the last thing that he would have told Bakugo, thinking that he had actually won the fight after sending a blast that would have knocked him back. He would have remembered him telling Bakugo, "How does it feel knowing a quirkless kid beat ya?" Which afterwards, Bakugo shot that big blast, Deku shot his own, and you know, now they're here. Deku thinking about that would get mad at himself, thinking that he didn't even beat the bastard. Deku sitting in his bed would be angry as eventually a couple of minutes more passing, Recovery Girl would kiss him, telling Izuku to go home and rest up. But once Izuku would do so, Deku would instantly start making some upgrades on his armor, making that thing way more durable and making it so that it's not going to be taking any damage to any of those weak explosions. Deku would literally start doing explosion tests in his own lab over the course of the next couple of days that they have before being told about the USJ, as Deku would end up creating an armor that is strong enough to tank full-on explosions, similar to the one that Bakugo would have used with his gauntlet. That said, with Izuku's upgrades to his costume being done, eventually Aizawa would go on to inform the class about the USJ, and everybody would have to get their own little permission slip signed. Obviously, since Deku can't just go to his dad and be like, "Hey dad, sign this," he sends him like a file which he has to sign like via like a digital, obviously. And with that being the case, we kind of just jump to seeing the classroom all on UA's bus, making their way to the USJ. In this timeline, I think that Izuku would actually be the class rep, considering the fact that he's a literal genius, so come on now, there's just no better choice. Anyways, he would do a great job at that, and even when they would have had that whole situation with the media breaking into UA, Deku would have handled that like a G, essentially telling everybody via screaming that it's okay, that it's just the media. He would have done that with some help from Uraraka, but I digress. Regardless though, as they're on the bus, people would begin talking about how impressive people's quirks are and talk about who the strongest is. Deku would even chip into the conversation saying that practically speaking, it's probably Todoroki, considering the fact that he has fire and an ice quirk. As Izuku, looking towards Todoroki, would think that it must be nice to have been born with such a credible quirk. As, everybody talking about this would say, yeah, it is, he has such an incredible quirk. To which Tsuyu would say, hey Izuku, I've been meaning to ask, Ribbit, what was it like growing up without a quirk all your life? Izuku would look at them saying, it's the usual, little bit of discrimination here, prejudice there, people doubting you here, the usual. Everybody hearing that with Izuku, he would have said that sarcastically and like jokingly. The bus would go quiet as Deku would say, I'm kidding. You guys do realize that, right? Like, yes, that stuff does happen, but it's not the end of the world. It's kind of similar to normal bullying, I guess. Everybody looking at him would say, yeah, as an awkward air would fill the room. Deku would kind of feel bad having made that comment, but regardless, they would finally make their way to the USJ, and as soon as they arrive, the class would be introduced to the Pro Hero 13, who would go on to give a speech to the students before all of a sudden Kurogiri would warp gate in the center of the area. It'd be at this moment that Izuku's scanners would start to go crazy, with Izuku detecting multiple different people in the USJ, turning towards Aizawa saying, wasn't there only supposed to be the few of us here? And Aizawa, seeing Kurogiri arrive in the center, would say, those are villains. It'd be at this point that Deku, realizing that that was a villain, would hold nothing back, holding his hand out as he would shoot a propulsor cannon towards the direction of Kurogiri, but it would end up going through his misty body, as we would then get a scene of Kurogiri being rushed by Bakugo and Kirishima, to which everybody would suddenly be warped away, or at least all the people that would have been originally. With that said, Deku would land in a body of water, being greeted to a ton of villains who would rush at him, but Deku, seeing this, would instantly fly out of the water, realizing that those are real villains, and not knowing what to do in this situation since that was his real first encounter against them, would land on the boat. It'd be at this moment that he would see Tsuyu and Mineta there, and he would ask them what their quirks are, thinking of ways to deal with the situation. Eventually, after a minute would pass, Deku would deduce that these villains must not know their quirks, considering that Tsuyu's there, and he would end up creating a quick plan to take them out, telling Tsuyu that she's going to be serving as backup and that the both of them are going to be going down there taking those villains out, with Mineta using his balls to throw them down there and them trying to essentially get the villains to get wrapped up in them so that they're all tangled up. That would be perfect for restraining the villains. So that's exactly what would happen. He and Tsuyu would fly towards the direction of the villains as they would go on to take out 20 plus bad guys, with Izuku being impressed at Tsuyu's power in water. This moment would also be the first time that Izuku could see the performance of his new suit, and it would be incredible. Deku would think that his dad and sister are geniuses, and as he's fighting against them, he would end up pretty much using a black whip type restraint to hold them all together, flying them towards the shore where they're unable to escape thanks to Mineta's balls. As with that being the case, and Deku, Tsuyu, and Mineta would end up scouting out the area. They would see that Aizawa was currently being absolutely destroyed by the Nomu, having his head being crushed by it, and Izuku, seeing this, just couldn't stare at this any longer. Deku would fly in as from his chest would shoot this massive beam of energy which would shoot right at the Nomu, and the Nomu would begin letting out a massive screech going as it would yell out in pain, with Izuku not caring, just watching his energy reserves going down as the beam would start to melt away at the Nomu. This would actually dang near be successful at killing it, which Shigaraki would notice, so he would rush towards the direction of Deku saying, "You damn brat, I won't let you kill the Nomu." He would get up close and personal with Izuku, as this would force him to get away from the Nomu and stop his beam. It'd be at this point that Izuku, jumping back, would avoid all of Shigaraki's attacks, to which he would get pissed and say, "Stop dodging me, you hero!" To which then Kurogiri, creating a portal, would lead Shigaraki to sticking his hand through it and grabbing onto one of Izuku's arms. One of his arm cannons would end up starting to disintegrate, and Deku, clicking a button, would proceed to have the arm fall off, as it would stop the rest of the suit from melting away. It'd be at this point that Shigaraki, smiling at Izuku, would freak him out, but Deku holding his repulsor blasters at him would shoot a beam at him, knocking him down. However, simultaneously, the Nomu would have rushed at him and would send a punch right at the side of Deku's body, bending him like a chair, as Deku would be sent flying a couple of meters away. It'd be at this point that Deku, looking up, would see a notification saying, "Warning, warning, critical damage has been done to the suit." Deku, on the ground trying to get up, having definitely felt that blow, would then sit there as the Nomu coming towards Izuku would punch him over and over and over in the head. It would then say, "Warning, warning, warning," as Izuku, seeing that, would then finally be like, "Enough!" and a massive amount of energy would shoot out from his chest, which would send the Nomu flying back, as Izuku, getting back up, would hold both of his arm cannons at the direction of the Nomu, thinking to himself that he needs to defeat this thing here and now. And so, shooting a beam of energy at the Nomu would be sent flying back. It'd be at this point that Deku would then get a notification informing him that he's used a lot of the power's suit. It would end up telling him that he's now at 37%. But Izuku, knowing that, wouldn't care about that. He would continue fighting the Nomu, trying to engage it in close quarters combat, but it's just too strong and none of his blows were doing a thing. It'd be at this point that a beam of ice would come flying towards the direction, and Izuku, seeing Todoroki, would say, "Todoroki, keep that thing still for me," as Deku would end up shooting his beam of energy at the Nomu, who was currently stuck in the ice, and as Shigaraki was going to come in at Deku, stopping him once more, Bakugo would come flying in, saying, "You damn villain, you better not move or I'm going to burn you so bad they'll be scraping you off the floor for weeks," as Izuku would shoot all of the energy that his suit had left to completely annihilate the Nomu. Now mind you, he nearly shot 40% of the suit's entire energy reserves, as this would leave Deku with like 1%, like a half a percent of energy, making it so that the suit could still like barely move. With Izuku having done that, he would then turn towards the direction of Kurogiri, who with a bit of fear in his eyes would kind of like look back as he would warp Shigaraki away, ending up pretty much leaving as the Nomu would be the only thing there. Deku's suit would finally power off, and Deku, realizing this, would end up pretty much getting out of it. The armor would end up coming off of Izuku's body, and it would all drop to the ground, with the suit helmet being the final thing. Deku would lift up the cap thing, as he would then look towards Todoroki, thanking him for his help, then turning towards Bakugo and saying that he guesses he thanks him as well, with Bakugo saying, "Don't thank me, you damn nerd, I wasn't here to help you, I was just trying to take care of the villain." As Izuku and all three of them standing there would all pretty much be waiting there until All Might would be told about the situation. He would arrive a couple of seconds after this, and seeing the fact that the students were able to take that thing down would be so incredibly proud of them. After this would take place, the students would all be released going home, as a week break would take place with the class. During this time, Deku would end up telling David about the fact that his suit ended up running out of energy mid-fight with the Nomu, saying that that was an incredibly difficult fight and that the suit did a lot, but ultimately running out of power is just something that he can't have in a fight. What was to happen if one day he's fighting off against so many villains, or maybe one that requires so much energy, and then he has to take out the remaining goons? Deku would think to himself that he needs something more reliable, and it'd be at this point that David and he would start pretty much brainstorming ideas. It'd be at this point that David would end up pretty much telling Izuku of a power source that he had thought might have been viable years ago, but he never figured out how to actually make it work. This would be the exact same one that Iron Man would end up having in the second movie, I believe, but regardless of that. With that being the case, Deku would start to do a bit of tinkering as to try to find out how to actually make it work, and he would end up inviting his friend Mei Hatsume. The both of them would start to brainstorm ideas as to how they could make this thing viable, and with Mei's incredible ideas and Izuku's like genius mind, the two of them would ultimately end up finding a solution for the power source. They end up creating the same one that Tony Stark would use, and the suit would now have so much power that there's just no way that Deku was going to be running out of it. This is a renewable source, one that he has to replace obviously every now and then, but it just has so much that Deku's never going to have to be worrying about replacing it in the middle of a fight. I mean, of course, not unless he releases a blast that could destroy an entire country. So with that being the case, Deku would end up pretty much upgrading the suit that he and his father would have been working on, and after adding the new power source, he would have had to revamp a lot of the things, but with Mei's help, I was going to say Melissa, they would end up doing that successfully. And after a long day of work, Deku would end up getting a ring at his doorbell with an Uber Eats order. Mei would have said that that's hers, as she would have ordered them a big old order of burgers from Big Belly Burger. As Izuku and Mei would kind of just sit there eating, he would thank her for that, and he would then pretty much end up asking her what she's been developing at school. She would go on to show him a ton of babies, saying that she even made a prototype suit for like an armor suit, one that's like really strong. Deku putting it on would start to have his back literally be bent like inwards, similarly to what would happen in canon, and she'd say, oops, my bad, guess I messed up the movement system. Deku would say, you nearly killed me, and she would say, yeah, but you're still here, aren't you? Deku and her would start like kind of just like laughing as, you know, Mei Hatsume would thank Deku for, you know, having her in his lab, and he would say, no, thank you, like you're the reason I developed this far. Mei would end up smiling at Izuku, and she would end up asking what his thoughts are on the school festival. He would say, yeah, he knows it's coming up, and she would say, yeah, it is. She thinks that when they go back to school, they might still have it. Izuku would say that he doesn't doubt it, that UA is the type of school to definitely have that event after everything that's happened, saying that something like this won't be stopping that. Mei would agree, and so the two of them just eating their food would end up finally finding themselves back in class, Mei in the support course and Deku in the hero course. He would be told about the sports festival, with Izuku thinking, I knew it, and so the day would finally come. Deku, making his way towards the front of the class, would be the one to actually give the speech, seeing as he ended up getting the best scores for the test. Now normally it would have been Bakugo, if not for the fact that Deku got those juicy rescue points. So this time, making his way up towards the front, he would give a really interesting speech telling everybody that if he could do it, they could do it. This would pump everybody up, and the first event of the test would start, consisting of the obstacle race. Deku, with his suit on, thanks to having submitted a formal application to use support items, would have ended up registering his suit as his only support item, and because that's, you know, kind of how he fights, he would be allowed to take that inside. So the second that it would begin, Todoroki would try freezing everybody in place, but Deku, knowing that would have happened, would use his propulsors to pretty much levitate up into the air as he would fly off towards the direction of the zero pointers even faster than Todoroki could even react. This would lead to Izuku's scanners pretty much doing their magic, as Jarvis would say, sir, attack them at this point. This is where their energy source is located. And Izuku, aiming his hand out, shooting propulsion blasters, would end up pretty much destroying all three of the robots, as an explosion would be left in its wake, and Deku would fly through the next sections of the obstacle, completely unopposed. Eventually arriving to the mine section, Deku would fly so low to the ground just so explosions could go off behind him, making him look really cool. And once he would make his way to the finish line, he would end up waving to everybody, with everybody shocked that Deku was the one who actually cleared the obstacle course first. That's impressive, but the most impressive thing of all would be the new speed that Deku now has access to. With the new power source, Deku no longer has to be pacing himself like he was before, trying not to use too much of the power. Now he's able to use dang near 100% of the old suit's capabilities, so this allows his thrusters to operate so much faster, and everything else just became so much more powerful. Deku then would be told that he's going to be getting the 1,000,000-point headband, and it'd be in this moment that Deku would be paired up with Mei Hatsume, much like in the original, Uraraka, as well as Tokiyami. This event is one that I'm not really a fan of, but to summarize the way that I think that they would get through this, using Izuku's analytical mind, he would decide that it's probably best to just keep the 1,000,000-point headband, considering he has the most points. So, using Mei Hatsume propulsors, they would shoot up into the air, and using Uraraka's quirk, they would pretty much fly up there, with Izuku giving each one of them their own propulsor boots alongside Mei Hatsume's air thing. This would lead them all to flying in the air so high that the only person capable of getting close to them would be Bakugo, but unfortunately for him, he still hasn't developed his AP blast. So Deku shooting his propulsor blast at Bakugo would have managed to keep him at bay, ultimately leading to them passing this event, and ultimately leading us to the 1v1 battles. That said, we immediately zoom in on Deku versus Shinso. Both combatants would step onto the ring, and the second that this would happen, Shinso would smirk, knowing that this is his best chance to get past. Shinso knows what it's like to be on the flip side of being called a villain for having a seemingly villainous quirk, so him thinking about this, he would pretty much try to use the different concept of that, of trying to pretty much get into Deku's head via talking to him about his quirkless status. Shinso would congratulate Izuku on making it so far, seeming actually kinda legit at first, until he finally would go on to tell him that the only reason that he's standing there is because he has had a power this whole time. Money. And it'd be at this point that Deku would get pissed, because all of the hard work that he has done over the years would be seemingly just reduced to him being a billionaire. He would get extremely mad at Shinso, and he would then say, "Shut up." Shinso would smirk, thinking that the battle was over, but it wouldn't be, because Deku's not an idiot. In this timeline, I just don't see a world in which Deku's just gonna let Shinso capture him and beat him that easily. So instead, Deku would actually deceive Shinso into believing that he was mind controlled, to which Shinso would then say walk off, and Deku would actually start doing that, before then stopping and laughing. He would then turn towards Shinso and blasting him with one of his armor pulsers. Shinso would be sent flying off of the arena as Deku would laugh and go on to pretty much tell Shinso that that was text-to-speech AI. As Shinso, hearing that, would get extremely pissed. He realized that Izuku completely duped him. He didn't respond to his quirk with his voice, and that's the reason that his mind control didn't work. It was a pretty clever strategy by Deku, and one that honestly took me a bit longer than it probably should have to actually think of. Anyways, with that being the case, Deku would win this battle, and then we would pretty much end up having the rest of the battles take place. Everybody who makes it to the second round would, and unfortunately in this timeline, we're not going to be getting the conspiracy theories from Todoroki, so Deku's not going to be anyone's secret love child, considering that everybody knows who his dad is. That said, with that being the case, he would wish Mei Hatsume luck, and she would then go up, do her battle against Ida, and ultimately give up after showing off all of her babies. That said, she would go on to tell Izuku that his suit is working like a charm, and Deku would smile, thanking her, saying that if it wasn't for her help, it wouldn't be functioning half as good as this. Then, we would end up getting the battle between Izuku and Todoroki, and the second that this match would start, I have no doubt that Todoroki wouldn't start anything off by shooting a massive pillar of ice at the direction of Deku. Deku seeing this, having studied Todoroki closely, knowing that he might have to potentially face off against his classmates, he definitely would have worked on some ice countermeasures, considering the first time that he had been, duped by ice when he had tried flying way too high, that definitely would have been something that he had fixed. However, the difference between heating your suit up when you're in the atmosphere and literally being frozen solid by someone's quirk is kind of large. So over the course that he would have had time to work on this in the 1 week break, he and Mei Hatsume, along with working on the power core, would have actually ended up working on a countermeasure to actually make Izuku's suit so hot it could seemingly melt straight through the ice. Similarly to what the, I believe it was the Iron Man 1 villain who could turn himself super hot or something like that. So he has those powers. And in case you guys don't get that reference, imagine a ball that has been superheated to an extremely high temperature and you drop it on ice. It would go right through it via melting. That's kind of what's happening. Deku standing in the ice would melt it all as he would walk right towards Todoroki using the mechanical strength of his suit, and as soon as he would get close, Todoroki would be freaked out, realizing that his ice, it just wasn't working. In this moment, Todoroki would reflexively use his flame side as he would shoot fire towards the direction of Izuku, to which Izuku would look at Todoroki, telling him that he's completely resistant to both his ice and fire quirk, saying that he studied his classmates and he created something that could perfectly counter anything he could throw at him. It'd be at this point that he would grab Todoroki via his collar and fly him off of the arena. Todoroki, however, would try to grab onto Deku's suit, freezing it as best as he could, but unfortunately it just wouldn't be enough. The suit, though it would give Deku a notification of it actually starting to be damaged because of just how point blank the contact was, it would ultimately hold up long enough for Deku to fly Todoroki off of the arena and lead him to be the winner. That said, after this would happen, we would actually get a battle between Izuku and Ida in the preliminaries to the final section, and with that being the case, Deku would clearly wipe the floor with him. The second the battle start, Deku would show off an improvement to his suit, which is literally Ida's whole little quirk. These engines would come out of his leg, and Deku, using those, would actually rush towards the direction of Ida using a reciprocal burst of sorts. This would stun Ida, who realized that he practically copied his quirk, as he would narrowly dodge Izuku, but due to Izuku's non-limitations thanks to the suit, he would change trajectories mid-air using his propulsors and land a full-on reciprocal burst kick right on Ida's face. This would lead Ida to be sent flying out of the arena, with him being stunned that Deku was able to do something like that and also control himself while he was inside of the suit. Ida thinks back to how he used to train when he was a kid working on his own quirk, and he would honestly be impressed with Izuku, proud if anything, considering the fact that he decided to implement things of his own classmates and ended up creating countermeasures via the suits that he would have made to actually win the whole sports festival. Ida would be incredibly proud of Izuku, and after the match would be over, he would tell him exactly that. Deku would have actually been a bit worried that some of his classmates might get mad mad at him for those changes, but they didn't. And that would honestly bring a huge smile to Deku's face, who thinks that his class is just the best. After this would happen, we would end up getting the final match of the finals, which would essentially be Deku versus Bakugo. And considering what ended up happening the last time that they fought, this one's personal. The second that the match would begin, there would be absolutely zero words exchanged, as Deku would stare at Bakugo and he would do the same, opting to actually just crush him. The second that the battle would start, Bakugo would fly in towards the direction of Deku, blasting an explosion square in his face, with Deku brushing it off and punching Bakugo in the stomach. Bakugo at this point would grab onto Izuku's suit, using his explosions to spin Deku right there in that moment, as Deku would be spun, but he would have regained control, grabbing onto Bakugo's arm and then throwing him away. It'd be at this point that you would hear the propulsors go as boom, like this little beam would be shot towards him. I know I tried replicating the little Iron Man sound propulsor effect, but I just couldn't do it. Anyways, this would shoot Bakugo some distance away, and Bakugo would say, "Oh yeah, you upgraded your suit, didn't you, Deku? Well, don't worry, I'm still gonna find a way to reduce that tin can suit to a piece of garbage." Flying up into the air, Bakugo would begin spinning over and over and over, preparing for a howitzer impact. All the while this would happen, Deku would look up at Bakugo saying, "Jarvis, what's he doing?" With Jarvis scanning Bakugo, saying it appears that he's going to try to lunge at you by creating a massive momentum with his explosions. Deku hearing that would smile, thinking to himself that he can't wait for him to try it. As we would get a scene of Deku creating a shield that he would have created using his armor, as it standing in front of him via his arms would proceed to block the howitzer impact, using his propulsors on his back to make sure that the blast doesn't have any recoil damage, sending him flying off the ring. This would work perfectly, and Deku would appear to have been standing still to take the force of the impact. Bakugo, after delivering the blow, would say, "What the? There's no way. How did you?" As Deku would smirk underneath his mask, and then holding both hands together, he would create a large cannon that would then ultimately blast at Bakugo, sending him flying off of the arena. It'd be at this point that Bakugo would be completely unconscious due to the force of the blast that hit him, head on mind you, and Izuku would be declared the winner. This would be such an incredible moment for Izuku, because he would have ended up showing Bakugo that he was wrong, that he did belong in UA, and that Izuku was ultimately the better of them. After this would be over, Deku would go to the mic, as he would go on to tell everybody in the world that not only did he win this, but he won this for every quirkless kid around the world, going on to tell everybody that he was quirkless, and if he was able to win the sports festival with nothing at all, then why should that stop anybody else who has a dream of becoming a hero? This clip would go viral everywhere, and quirkless people around the world would start to feel a lot more motivation to not give up on their dreams. This would spark a new era of quirkless people starting to stand up for themselves, and Izuku would be the public hero of, the school. With that said, the medals would be handed to everybody, and Deku, after getting first place, would be hugged by All Might, who would tell him that he's so proud of how much growth that he's done. As Deku would smile, and we would then pretty much jump cut to the very next scene, with the students all pretty much returning to UA and being told that they're now tasked to pick hero names. Deku obviously would go on to pick the hero name Iron Man, because come on now, what else was he supposed to pick? But anyways, when it comes to his internship, I actually had to think about this really hard, because I actually had no idea what direction I wanted to take the story. However, I ended up deciding that it would probably be pretty sick for Deku to return to Island and use his internship time to actually train with his father, considering that his quirk isn't exactly something that exists, so the only training that Izuku could really do was work on his mind and upgrade his suit. He would tell this to the heroes in Nezu, and they would actually end up agreeing with Izuku, saying that that's probably the best course of action for him. He would actually end up also inviting another student who actually goes to his school in Mei Hatsume, and the both of them would make their way to Island. Both of them would end up boarding the plane, as Mei would be extremely excited, sketching a bunch of random ideas as they're on their way there, with her asking what the island's gonna be like. Deku would go on to tell her many things of what it was like growing up on said island, and she would say that she bets it was awesome. She'd be super excited to meet the David Shield, as well as his sister, who he's told her so much about, but Deku overall would think that he's excited to have his dad meet her. She's an incredible mind, and one day, he and her are both gonna be easily surpassing his father, as well as Melissa, he would think. That said, the two of them would eventually end up arriving to the island, and once they would get there, Melissa would greet the two of them saying that she didn't know the person he was bringing was a girl. She would tease Izuku, pretty much going on to say that he clearly likes her, but Izuku would say that it's actually not like that at all. He would kind of look down for a second as he would say that all she thinks about is her babies. Melissa would be like, "What? What do you mean her babies?" As Deku would say, "Didn't you watch the sports festival?" Melissa would then remember what he's referencing, and she's like, "Oh, right. As Deku would look at her and say that she doesn't have time for love. From here, Melissa would look at Izuku saying, "You like her, don't you?" As Izuku would kind of put like a finger up and like, "Shh." And Melissa would say, okay, I won't say anything. After this would happen, we would end up pretty much getting the full week where during this time, they would actually end up creating some improvements to the suit, making it completely ice resistant. Because remember, before when Todoroki actually managed to get a close-up attack and actually land it and just like funnel all of his ice power into him, that actually did some decent damage. But before that happened, he was practically invulnerable to it. After all, what was he gonna do? Activate his defense system while Todoroki was grabbing him and burning his hand? Doesn't seem very hero-like. Deku would end up upgrading his armor alongside his family, and with him, Mei Hatsume, Melissa, and David's shield, they would end up making some absolutely insane improvements, making it way more durable using new materials, adding way more things to it such as shields and different guns and gauntlets and guns that literally come out of his shoulders and shoot like little bullets that are like similar to Warhead. This dude ends up improving the Black Whip tendrils, adding electricity to them similar to what Vanko would have done in the second movie. He would even end up improving Ida's Recipro Burst thing. He adds explosions similar to what Bakugo can do. He even ends up throwing in a different shield that this time isn't comprised of his armor. It's like an energy shield that Deku can hold out in front of him, similar to the one that he would have used to actually fight Thanos in the MCU movies. That said, during this time period, Deku would actually even end up creating a suit for Mei Hatsume herself, in case she ever needed to come out to the battlefield and help Izuku, with David making one for himself and Melissa doing the same. Now, normally I'd end up saying something along the lines of, oh, they use these suits to actually protect the island, which could maybe be a thing that they end up doing, but I mean, considering that they already have robots to protect the island, I don't think it's actually gonna be necessary. That said, they would also make the suit completely lightning resistant, considering that could be a problem for them somewhere down the line in case Deku ever encounters a character with the lightning quirk. He would already have that there just due to Kaminari in case he ever was to like try to fight him, but that's besides the point. Eventually, 5 days into the internship, they would all end up getting a notification, and by all I mean the students, as they would be told that the internship is completely over and everybody has to go home. Fortunately for Izuku, he's actually with his family, so he doesn't actually have to go anywhere and he's actually allowed to stay there. Unfortunately though, Mei Hatsume, she's not part of the family, so she actually had to end up going home, and once there, all of them got the news that Ida was dead. They end up coming out on the news and Yue ends up giving a full speech about what happened, saying that after Ida found out the news about his brother, he ended up trying to seek revenge and that ended up leading to his death. The hero killer got to him during the night of the Nomu's attack and Stain ended up getting away. So in this timeline, Stain just pretty much gets another body, but it would be a student from UA, which would cause massive panic everywhere, and this would actually lead to UA being shut down. Not as in the whole entire school is done for completely, but it's 100% going to go into a fat hiatus. Every single student that's a part of UA has to go home for a specific break, as we would end up getting scenes of everybody reacting to the death of Ida, but the class rep would hit harder, and that is Izuku. As he would sit there reading the fact that Ida was dead because he went off to go fight off against the hero killer, Deku would get extremely pissed at himself, thinking that he was the class rep, and he's responsible for everything that happens in the classroom. Ida was his responsibility, and him not thinking about Ida as much as he should have is the reason that he was dead. He was so focused on upgrading his suit and spending time with Mei Hatsume that he had completely overlooked how Ida must have been feeling, and Deku completely blames himself. This would lead Deku to essentially breaking the rules and deciding that he was going to be taking the hero killer Stain's imprisonment into his own hands. Considering that the police didn't have too much to go off of in terms of Stain, Deku would end up hacking into all of Hosu City's cameras, essentially trying to track him down. The second that Deku would find out about this, he would act fine on the surface, but one day, Melissa would notice that Deku was gone, and his suit was gone as well. Deku, using the tracker that they have on him, would actually be located in Hosu City, and Izuku, with a laptop that he would be using, would be trying to find Stain himself via using all of the traffic cameras that are around, as well as smartphones, hacking into people's technology and making it so that he could actually track Stain one way or the other. Eventually, he would end up getting a ping that Stain was nearby, and flying off towards the direction of Stain as he was trying to kill a hero. Deku would arrive there, as it would not be Native this time, because I can see Native actually dying this time. It's another random low-key hero. Actually, I think it could even be Manuel, him trying to get back at Stain for killing the student that he was responsible for protecting. This could be a scene in which Deku arrives as Manuel would be on the ground completely bleeding out due to Stain's quirk, and Deku would stand there telling Stain that he's done. His air cannon would end up loading up as boom, it would shoot a blast at Stain, who would narrowly dodge out of the way. He would ask Izuku if he's here to get revenge for that brat too, with Izuku asking Stain why he had to kill him. Stain would say that he wasn't a hero, that he was a fake, only in it for himself, out here to get revenge instead of protecting people. Izuku, hearing that, would get pissed because he knows that Ida was one of the coolest people ever, and so, using a reciprocal burst kick, he would fly towards the direction of Stain, who would jump out of the way and try to stab at Deku. However, because of Deku's armor, that made it completely impossible, with Deku smiling under the mask and saying, "What's wrong, hero killer? You finally realize that little blood curdle quirk isn't going to be working on me?" As Stain would be shocked that Deku knows exactly what his quirk's name is and how it functions. Deku would smile underneath his suit as he would fly towards the direction of Stain, and he would end up wrapping him with these cables that would power lightning through his body. Stain would be completely shook by this attack, as he would fling him up into the air, and Deku would fly off towards his direction, shooting propulsor blasts at him, eventually reaching him and punching him square in the stomach. It'd be at this point that Stain, taking a blade out, would try to stab into the nooks and crannies of Izuku's suit, trying to find any openings, but he would completely fail at this, considering Deku would close that off. Deku in this moment would tell him to back off, activating the heat signature of his suit, as this would lead Stain to actually burn his knife as it would melt, and Stain would start to feel increase heat come off of Izuku's arms that were holding him. Deku, feeling so angry at Stain, would actually feel like killing him in this moment, and he would fly up into the atmosphere as Stain would start losing oxygen rapidly. You could just hear him going like he was clearly unable to breathe, and Deku was just taking him higher and higher until, looking at the face of Stain, this would make Deku realize that he regretted what he was doing. He would fly down with Stain being unconscious due to him making it to the atmosphere and lacking oxygen, as Izuku, dropping him off at the police station, would leave a note essentially telling them to lock him up in the deepest, darkest part of the prison. That said, he would fly off, and the police would not actually find out who it is, with the only people knowing that Deku did this being David and Melissa. With that said, the hero killer being brought to justice would go viral in the news, and the heroes would end up marketing it as UA actually being the ones responsible for that. Tenya family would obviously know about the fact that that wasn't the case, but them being huge advocates for the school UA, and knowing that what happened was kind of just misfortunate events. It's not like it was their fault or they even wanted this to happen. It was just a product of what happened with his brother. Obviously, the hero Ingenium would be extremely sad about the passing of his younger brother, but at this point it's just like, what are you going to do about it, Regardless, with that being the case, after the hero killer incident would finally die down in, I want to say, 2 weeks, the students would return to UA and undergo normal school activities, with everybody trying to act like things are okay, until eventually somebody finally says something. Kirishima, slamming his hands on his desk, would say, "Are we just gonna pretend that Ida isn't dead? One of our classmates is gone, and now we're back to normality as if that didn't just happen." Everybody would kind of look down, as Aizawa would say that he knows how they feel, but at the end of the day, Ida was not a person who would have wanted them to give up on being heroes just because he had an unfortunate passing. After hearing that, Kirishima would say, "I know, but we need to do something for him." And so the class would end up all making their way towards Ida's funeral or grave, as they would all spend the entire day there and they would all say some few words for him. After this would all be said and done, everything would kind of feel a little bit better, and the students would end up returning back to class where they would start normal, hero stuff. For about a week, this is what would happen until eventually the students would be told that because of the stuff that ended up happening recently, they're actually going to be moving their final exams back a couple more weeks. So the students would have a lot more time to prepare in this timeline, but eventually the final exams would come around. In this timeline, I can actually still see Deku being paired up with Bakugo to face off against All Might, just like it would happen in the original, just because even though Deku doesn't have one for all, he's paired up with Bakugo due to the fact that they don't like each other clearly. So that's just a conflict of interest, and then during the fight, I don't know, I just don't know what would actually happen. Would Bakugo respect him more because of the fact that he can actually now start to acknowledge that Deku belongs at UA and maybe try to go along with the plan with him? Or would Bakugo still act like a complete jerk to Deku and ultimately lead to them potentially failing? Ultimately, I don't know, but the biggest part of me kind of wants to give this W to All Might after Izuku wouldn't be able to actually use his cannon blasters. Obviously, if he did use them at full power, he'd probably be able to be All Might, but the fact that he's limited in the fact that he can't take things too far with All Might, I can see Deku actually losing this fight, which is ultimately a really good thing for his character development because this would lead Deku to have the idea to make the All Might Buster Suit. After being actually destroyed by All Might and having a bunch of punches thrown at him, which would definitely injure him, this would remind him a lot of the Nomu, and he would compare All Might to the Nomu himself. Obviously without those specific quirks, Deku would fail due to the fact that he was ultimately unable to defeat All Might. Or actually no, let's say that instead of that, Deku would try to fight off against All Might to help Bakugo, but he would get absolutely ragdolled, which ultimately leads him to then having to create a plan in which he passes because he ran away, but it's not like he did it with Bakugo by his side. So Bakugo in this timeline, which funny enough, is going to be part of the remedial course where they're going to be learning extra stuff like Hiroshima, Sero, Mina, maybe it was Mineta part of it? I'm not too sure. But regardless, he would be part of that group of students who actually ended up failing, and Deku, with this experience not having to fail, he would actually end up developing the idea of the Hulk Buster armor. I think that that's a much better story to go down because the more I started thinking about it, I just don't actually see Deku actually failing this test just due to the fact that he can fly, and so escaping the actual area itself might be a little easier for Deku. Plus with the brains that he have, I can just see him ultimately developing a strategy that creates an opening for Deku long enough for him to escape the area and passing the test. After the final exam section would finally be over, normally in the story, this is when the Two Heroes movie would happen. And the only reason that I'm going to cover it in this video is going to be due to the fact that A, Deku is literally David Shield's son, so there's no way he's going to miss it. And 2, this is where I had a really cool idea to have something go down in this part of the story that I just was not going to be missing the opportunity to do. Also, let me know down below in the comments what you guys actually think about this video so far, considering that in my lifetime, I've heard 2 videos related to this topic. One that Izukage made and one that another creator named Sir Plotsalot made a long time ago. It was an incredible 4-part series that never got finished. So I'm kind of happy that I'm finally making my own little Iron Man Deku video, and I mean, I honestly could not be more proud of the way that it's turning out. Maybe there was a couple missed opportunities or something that I haven't included so far, but the way that I see it so far, I'm pretty proud of how it's going. Regardless, moving on to the story. With that being the case and the final exams finally being over, they would have approximately about a couple of weeks worth of summer, and it would be during that time that Deku would send a full-on group message to everybody in class 1A, essentially inviting them all to the Island Expo. During this time, I can see everybody pretty much accepting to go, with Bakugo going because Kirishima would convince him and all of the rest of the students doing so as well. This is when everybody would kind of have a coin flip moment where they all decide on who's going to be actually making the preview of the Island stuff. This would lead the same original cast of members to end up going with them as they do in the original, and so we would end up having the same sort of events going down in canon, with 2 changes happening to the beginning of this arc. Number 1, Mei Hatsume is also going to be there. However, her presence won't even actually really be felt, because once she gets to the island, she would pretty much thank thank Deku for the invitation and make her way to David's lab, where she starts tinkering, creating one of her new babies. Now, it's not like she's on the normal lab, she's actually in the secret lab that Deku has in the Island area. So being there, Melissa would actually end up using her technology that she has access to create a new baby, which is what she's currently focused on with the help of Melissa, who's helping her out with most of the kinks. Explosions would be going on in the lab and a lot of girl talk would be happening. All the while simultaneously on the other side of the island, Deku would be showing his classmates what it was like to live on Island for most of his life. They would say that, oh, it must have been really cool, and Deku would say that it was, that his dad's the best, and yada yada yada. Oh, also, All Might's obviously there because Deku would obviously personally invite him, seeing as, it is Uncle Might. So with that being the case, the Island Expo event would finally happen, and we would get a scene of Deku looking extra spiffy. My man has this nice watch, he has a full black suit, this man looks tall, he has his hair all done and stuff, way better than the ugly outfit that Deku used for that, because what the heck was that outfit, like genuinely? Who wears a brown/maroon suit to a freaking island? Like, that was just so ugly, bro. That had no class. But regardless, I got Deku looking spiffy, and he's pretty much sitting there waiting for Mei Hatsume to finally arrive when Melissa would enter and say that she's sorry, but she's gonna be a bit late. She says that she was working on something in the lab, and Deku, hearing that, would feel a little disappointed, but he knows how Mei is, so he's like, always something with her. Eventually, everybody would finally end up arriving, and once that would happen, all of a sudden the systems of the actual area would go haywire. Just like in the original story, the villains would take over because of David's shield wanting All Might to remain the symbol of peace, and we would end up getting a whole lockdown with the security system going crazy. With that being the case, the students would end up essentially going to find out what things are like in the main hall, and once they would end up arriving, they would end up seeing All Might captured. Deku, seeing this, would be stunned, and knowing that he doesn't have his suit, would actually start having conflicts about whether he should help or not. But knowing that everyone on this island is in danger, that would include Melissa, Mei, his father, and clearly All Might. Deku, seeing this, would take this personal and decide that he's gonna help regardless of whether he has his suit or not. He would tell that to the rest of the class, and all of them would agree that they need to be heroes right now, and they would all decide to go on and help. This would eventually lead the students to going up the emergency stairs, and they would climb up tons and tons of floors. I believe it was to the 60th floor, where they end up encountering villains and ultimately seeing Katsuki and Kirishima, who are on the top. They end up fighting off against the villains who's able to create wings, and the dude who can turn in like an angry Hulk. And after this would take place, the students continue going up, with Mineta climbing up the building like he does in the movie, eventually getting us to that one section in the plot of the movie where they're at the top. But in order to get there, Uraraka has to use her quirk float to fly them up there, or not fly, but gravity them up there. With that being the case, Deku, not having One For All, wouldn't have the leaping power, but because he and Melissa are the ones that are going to be able to disarm the system, they're both floated up there by Uraraka. All the while, a ton of robots start getting closer to them and are about to attack Uraraka. Deku's like, Uraraka, and Melissa's like, are you okay? Melissa's like, drop us. But Uraraka, being the hero she is, wouldn't do so. And as they were about to actually get to her and stop their plan from working, causing Deku and Melissa to actually die, because not die, but if they fell from that height, they'd get gravely injured. Suddenly, a pink Iron Man suit would fly in out of nowhere. And I'm pretty sure many of you guys can already know who that is. Mei Hatsume would come in out of nowhere, straight up saving the day. She would shoot her propulsor blasters at the direction of the robots, and she would end up telling them to go as they would fly to the top of the floor. And Mei Hatsume would essentially throw a briefcase at Deku. Two of them, actually. One of them would be for Melissa, and the other one would be for Deku. His green Iron Man costume, which she ended up making for him. Obviously, Deku isn't green, but let's just give him a green costume. But regardless, he would catch this, and Melissa would do so as well, as they would have a whole suit-up moment. The armor would go on their bodies, and then looking toward the direction of the area where they're finally going to go to, they would enter. The first villain to arrive would be one with a knife knife quirk, which can essentially turn his body into a blade. He would try to attack at Deku, but because his body was made, or armor was made of iron, in this moment it just wouldn't work. The attack would completely botch, and Melissa, holding her hand out, would shoot a blast of energy towards the villain. With that said, the two of them would continue forth, trying to make their way towards the system where they're actually going to have to shut everything down, and arriving to it, they would easily be able to stop everything. It'd be at this moment that the two of them, after having saved everybody, would then decide to make their way towards they think that their father's out. Arriving, they would end up seeing the scene of Wolfram shooting David and pretty much telling him that he's a fool for believing him. At this point, David's little assistant, who Deku is very close with, mind you, like he's known him his whole life, would be like, why? As the dude would say, I had to do this. Then at this point, David, he gets betrayed and David jumps in the way, like taking the gunshot for him. With Deku and Melissa seeing this, they're just like, nah. As we get a scene of Deku and Melissa with both of them in their iron armors fighting against Wolfram. And mind you, they're doing extremely well at this point, dodging all of the metal beams that Wolfram would be throwing at them, because at this point he still hasn't used the quirk enhancement. But it would be at this point that him realizing that they're actually posing a problem, calling the airplane or the jet or the airplane or whatever it was that he ended up using, the helicopter, he would end up pretty much walking away with David with the quirk enhancer device in his hand, saying that they need to stay out of this, when suddenly another armor would come in, which would be Mei's, and she would blast Wolfram to the ground, with him dropping the quirk enhancement device and David. This would lead a bloody David to be on the ground in pain, as all three of them would proceed to gang up on Wolfram, who, without having access to the quirk enhancement device, there's just no way he was going to be able to stop them. So without any hesitation, they would absolutely end up destroying this dude and completely saving the day without All Might even having to tax himself like he would in the original. With that being the case, after this would happen, they would end up pretty much questioning their father as to why he did that, and he ends up pretty much admitting that his plan was stupid and he got tricked into doing that, saying that this was all a dumb ploy. After this happens, All Might would arrive and the whole situation would kind of be cleaned up. Oh, and one more thing I want to mention, there would definitely be some sort of scene in which, David pretty much tells All Might he made this for him, but then he crushes it, saying he was so wrong to think that he couldn't trust in the next generation, as he would look at his son and tell him that he's proud of him, looking to Mei, saying that he's proud of her, and Melissa as well, as Deku, looking towards Melissa, would say, now that you have this suit, you could still continue your dream of being a hero. As Melissa, looking to Deku, would smile with, the little cap of the armor, like showing her face, she would smile, telling Izuku that she doesn't want to do that. After all, she doesn't exactly want to steal all his thunder. Deku, hearing that, would say, "What?" As Melissa would start laughing and Deku would say, "You wouldn't do that." As it'd be at this point that Mei, coming in with low-key the best armor to this point yet, would end up pretty much telling Izuku if, he's proud of it. Deku would say that he is, saying that he loves the color. He's like, hot pink definitely suits ya. Mei would start smiling, and then after this, the whole cleanup situation would happen. After this arc would take place, I could see everybody returning back to the normal school stuff, and this is when we would finally begin the Forge training camp stuff. With that whole experience that Deku had on the island, of him essentially having a period in time in which without his suit, he was literally useless, I can actually see Deku taking that to heart, and in this specific timeline, creating the gear that actually helped him to call his suit forth whenever he wasn't necessarily next to it. So he's not going to have like a watch that's able to use nanotechnology or something like that. However, much like in Iron Man 3, when the armor pieces all fly at him and kind of injure him a bit, that would happen. Deku begins making the suit just like that, as Deku would end up pretty much finishing even the Hulkbuster armor during the time that he would be here, and doing just a whole lot of just experimenting and creation and stuff like that. Obviously, Mei wouldn't be present in this time because she's back at UA tinkering in the lab, and then we got Deku and the rest of the students here. So the Forge training camp actually goes kind of like normal. Nothing happens until eventually the Vanguard Action Squad would come into the picture, and that's when this whole arc would finally start to get interesting. Because the night that the attack would take place, Deku instantly calling his armor forth, knowing that there's danger here, would fly up into the air, looking around as using his scanner he would say, "Jarvis, can you locate our classmates?" Jarvis would do just that, saying that everyone is at these specific locations. After seeing that, Deku would look over the report, seeing that Kota, the literal child, was off by himself. So flying towards the direction of Kota, Deku would arrive hoping that he wasn't in danger. Unfortunately for Kota though, he was about to be killed by Muscular, who would try to crush him with his fist, but before that could happen, Deku flying in would save Kota, telling him to get out of here, as he would land on the ground and Muscular looking towards him would say, "You're the hero who won the sports festival. It's gonna be fun crushing your armor." As lunging towards the direction of Izuku, he would throw a punch to which a shield would pop up, blocking the blow, sending Deku flying. He would fly into the air and start shooting propulsor blasts, and Muscular jumping into the air would try to grab at his leg to pull him down. It'd be at this point that Deku would try stalling Muscular as long as he can, just shooting blasters at him and stuff like that. Although while Muscular's like blocking it, he would tell Deku that that stuff's weak, as Izuku would say he knows that that won't work on him, but these might. He would start shooting like much heavier like blasts at Muscular, and these would start packing damage. However, the muscle fibers that would be torn would grow right back, with Muscular's incredible quirk helping him in this situation. With that being the case, Deku, as he's stalling, would end up having Muscular scream at him, "Why don't you come here and die, kid?" To which Deku would say, "Because I was stalling." All of a sudden, these massive red and gold parts come flying at Deku, and they would clasp onto his already suit, as Deku would turn into the All Might Buster suit. And in that moment, Deku would land before Muscular, to which he cracks his knuckles and smiles, as we would end up getting a fight similar to the Iron Man versus the Hulk fight, except in this timeline, there's no way that Muscular's going to be contending with Deku. Deku would use that little function of the suit to just punch Muscular square in the face, just like go to sleep, go to sleep, go to sleep, go to sleep, as Muscular straight up just passes into unconsciousness, and Deku would defeat him in a match of straight up brute strength. With that being the case, Kota watching him, he would be so just shocked at the strength that Deku showed and how cool he was as a hero. He would thank him for that, and right after this would happen, Deku would take Kota in his arm, leaping towards the direction of where he knows Aizawa's at and dropping Kota off. After this, he would fly towards the direction of his students or fellow students, as he would arrive right in front of Tokiyami, allowing him to control Dark Shadow. Using the flamethrower function, he would cause Tokiyami, or Dark Shadow actually, to calm down because of the light that was introduced to the area, as Tokiyami would finally control him, and then we would now get a scene of the three of them rushing towards Bakugo and Todoroki. Once they end up arriving, because they're the nearest ones there, they would end up helping take out Moonfish, as Deku lunging at him would straight up punch him once, shattering Moonfish's teeth and sending him crashing into 3 trees, breaking them and literally breaking tons of his bones. With that being the case, Bakugo would say, "What the heck are you doing here, you nerd?" As Deku would say that he's here to save them. Todoroki would thank Deku, saying, "Thank you for your help, Midoriya," as they would then go on to find Uraraka. Seeing Toga, to which, she, not wanting to die like she doesn't in the original, would say, "I don't feel like dying tonight," as she would rush off, and we would then get the section of the story in which Mr. Compress would arrive and use his little quirk to turn Bakugo and Tokiyami into marbles. With that being the case, because Deku's not injured and he can literally fly off towards Moonfish, Deku would do just that. But because the Hulkbuster's specialty wasn't exactly flight, Deku would click the disengage button in his armor, as all those parts would fly off of him and they would turn back into this big box. After this happens, Deku at this point would fly towards the direction of Mr. Compress, about to take both of the marbles, when suddenly the Warp Gate quirk would appear in front of Izuku. Deku would be teleported miles away at this point, and Izuku landing there would be like, "Damn it!" punching at the ground, realizing that he had just failed. It'd be at this point that without Deku being there to, try to stop them, they would actually successfully not only kidnap Bakugo, but Tokiyami as well. Now, normally, I would say that this would end up actually leading the students to going after Bakugo and Tokiyami in an effort to save them, but because the last time that one of UA students went off trying to play hero on his own literally died, I just don't see that being the case. However, I could see a scene in which Deku actually goes to visit the students who got injured and overhears what Momo gave to the police. With that being the case, I can actually see Deku hacking into that tracking device and going off to try to save Bakugo and Tokiyami by himself. Deku doing so would fly off with his new and improved, not Hulkbuster armor, but his new and improved armor, which now, after finally developing the tech for this, would be repping the armor that Iron Man had prior to the nanotech. So the practically nearly perfect one that the only like literal downside was the fact that Ant-Man could get inside of it because of how small he could turn. So with that being the case, there's literally going to be only one more upgrade in the story, which leads us to the nanotech armor that gives him all those sick abilities. But regardless of that, Deku arriving with this new sick black armor would use his scanners to check the area, and seeing that it was nothing but Nomu, Deku would be stunned, saying there's more of those things, as he would end up realizing that this is not where Kirishima, or sorry, not Kirishima, but Tokiyami and Bakugo were. Eventually, he would end up hearing an explosion go off in the distance, as he realizes that that must be where they truly have him. This was only the tracker that led to the Nomu. Seeing that the heroes were actually on the scene, Deku would breathe a sigh of relief, realizing that he doesn't have to actually do this thing he was trying to. And so, Deku, about to sneak away, would suddenly see All For One arriving. As Deku would watch as Best Genius would save most of the heroes and then ultimately practically get killed before his very eyes. Deku, seeing this and that this new threat had just arrived before them all, would come out of the shadows of hiding and tell All For One that he wasn't gonna kill him. So before All For One could actually, like, I know I said he kills Best Genius, but this is before he shoots that tendril at him. Deku comes in and using his shield would end up blocking the blow. As flying towards the direction of All For One, he would end up trying to punch at him with his arm turning into like a hammer thing. With that being the case, All For One would create a barrier in front of him, as he would end up telling Izuku that he's the young genius with the incredible technology. He would pretty much tell him that he's very intrigued to see how much stronger he can get with all that quirk technology. It'd be at this point that Deku would end up telling All For One to shut up, as he would face off against All For One, but All For One would simply tell him that even though he is powerful, what he has is but a mere imitation, as he would shoot tons of quirks at the direction of Izuku, blowing a massive section of the city up, with Deku being sent flying back and him realizing that this is the real deal. Mind you, Deku has never heard of anybody having multiple quirks, so him seeing this would be just in shock, realizing that that concept even exists. Because remember, in this timeline, he doesn't know about One For All, he doesn't know about All For One, and he sure as heck doesn't know about every single quirk that All For One has at his disposal. So, with Deku going into this battle blind, Deku would end up clicking a button which would ultimately lead to tons and tons of Iron Man armor flying at him. However, he needs to stall All For One for at least a minute. Deku standing in front of him would ask him why he's doing this, and it'd be at this moment that All For One would speak to Deku a little bit before All Might would finally arrive. In this moment, we would then get All Might being the one who serves the purpose to distract All For One, as the League of Villains members would arrive and Bakugo would as well, being teleported there by All For One. At this moment, Deku would save Bakugo, getting him out of the range of impact, with Bakugo saying, "Get off me, you damn nerd," and Tokiyami thanking him, with Bakugo being like, "I didn't ask for your help," as you know, Deku's just kind of there in the battle. And with this happening, I can actually see the armored suits finally arriving. A ton of them would do so. It'd be like 50 of them. And as Deku's standing there with All Might, he would actually be a pivotal part of this battle. He would help All Might defeat All For One, and the battle would go much easier than it would in canon. All Might would be the one to deal much of the heavy damage, and Deku's armor would pretty much be used to shoot blasters and go flying at him in case All For One was ever getting too ahead of himself. Obviously, with All For One having to face off so many opponents, the battle would be so different than the one that we get in the original, and it's more of a callback to what ends up happening at the end of the Iron Man movie with all the armors come flying in and stuff like that, as this would be the first moment that people see the capabilities of Izuku. And with that being the case, after All For One would be defeated, Deku and All Might would go crazy in the news, with a press conference being held as to how All Might felt having a UA student being a massive help to him in that fight. All Might obviously would still be getting a massive part of the credit, but people can't like knock Deku anymore. He continues to go viral at the fact that he's doing so much without a quirk, and after this would take place, the media finally calming down about this, it would officially come out that All Might was going to be retiring from the hero scene, considering that now he could only even use his buff form for more than an hour. And as more time would pass, the last final embers that he had of One For All, they're going to completely disappear. So with All Might stepping down as the #1 hero, a lot of articles would go on to say that someone has to take the mantle of #1 soon, and they all are thinking that it's probably going to be Deku. However, they're not accounting for the real successor of One For All, which is that of Mirio. And obviously he's still going to be the #1 hero in this timeline, just because even if he's literally the #1 hero at the end of the anime once everything was said and done, and now giving him One For All on top of that, minus all those extra quirks that he should be getting, he's definitely going to be way stronger than Deku, even with all of his crazy armored gadgets and stuff. But I digress. After this would end up taking place, the students would finally then take the Provisional Hero licensing exam, and the events would kind of go much like you would expect. Deku obviously would use his support course items and would be able to actually pass this test with flying colors, having incredible capabilities when it comes to saving people, seeing as he has access to Jarvis, can locate multiple people, and is practically the perfect rescue hero all in all. And with that being the case, Deku and most of the students who get their hero licenses would still pass. The only two failures would be Bakugo and Todoroki. And last thing I need to mention for this arc, there is no Deku versus Kacchan part 2, because remember, or technically part 3, because in this timeline, that whole situation where Bakugo forces All Might to like retire, that still technically happens, but it doesn't feel the same. It doesn't have that same impact because All Might doesn't retire for the reasons that everyone thinks he does in the original. Everyone still believes All Might to be All Might, you know? But I digress. Also, there's just not the same like emotional moment or the stakes for that fight to still happen. So with that being the case, we're able to actually move on to the next arc, that being the Overhaul arc. This arc would all begin with Izuku and Mei Hatsume in Power Loader's lab, as inside of there he would be helping Mei with some creation. It'd be at this moment that Power Loader would tell Izuku, hey, don't you think you should be in class? I heard today you guys are going to have some pretty special guests. As that said, you could just see a panel of Mirio and the rest of the big three walking by the door, with Izuku looking at them wondering who they are. It'd be at this point that Deku would agree that he probably should make his way to class, as making his way there, Deku would walk inside and being the latest one there, would actually be told by Aizawa, sit down Izuku, as he would then go on to explain that today they're going to be being mentored by the big three, the three most promising heroes that are currently at their school. Deku hearing that would say, most promising, don't you mean me? With a little bit of cockiness in his voice, as Aizawa would say, well, you are incredibly impressive for a first year. You still haven't seen nothing yet. Mirio here has had a recent quirk awakening, and after that happened, he's become incredibly more powerful. With Izuku hearing that, he'd be stunned at the fact that that's even the case, as he would wonder just how strong this student is. Unfortunately for him though, he was going to be finding out very soon, in a very painful way. That said, Mirio versus Class 1A would still be a canon event, and we would get a scene of Mirio just absolutely destroying all of Class 1A, when we eventually get Mirio coming face to face with Izuku. Obviously not able to use the same ability he used in the original of trying to feint an eye poke and then punching him in the stomach because he has the armor on. Mirio would phase towards him so fast using the power of One For All, as in an instant he would practically disappear and gut punch Deku. Mind you, this is not the armor he's hitting, this is the literal body of Deku. He would have phased right through his armor and made contact with him with his fist, having extreme precision with his quirk, having trained with it over the last couple of months, practically being unable to use it when he actually got One For All. So in that moment, Deku would get blatantly knocked out, not having the craziest durability, seeing as at the end of the day, he's still a normal human. So once he would wake up, he would be told about how everything went down, and seeing a recording of what actually happened in that moment, he would see that for a split second, Jarvis recorded a moment where lightning burst off of him, and Izuku seeing that would say, what is that? After this would take place, Deku would wonder how exactly his quirk managed to mutate so hard, and he would end up pretty much digging into this a little bit, going up to Mirio himself and asking him why exactly his quirk mutated. Mirio would try to make some dumb excuse, and Izuku would say, cut cut the stuff. I know that All Might gave you his quirk. Deku at this point, as he's telling him, All Might would actually be walking in as he's like, young Midori, it's not what it looks like. But Deku would say, it is what it looks like. You clearly gave him your quirk. Last time you were at Island, my dad told me that your quirk reading levels were extremely low. And here comes this kid who's supposed to have a pure mutation quirk, basically able to hit me through my armor, flashing with speed that's comparable to yours in your prime. Yeah, right, All Might. You gave him your quirk. Fess up. All Might, looking towards the direction of Izuku, would say, well, sorry, nephew, I just couldn't risk telling anybody about the truth of One For All. Izuku would say, are you kidding me? Your quirk's name is literally the reverse of that villain we fought. And All Might would kind of like hold the back of his head, being like, well, yeah, I mean, it is derived from him. In this moment, we would pretty much get a scene of All Might explaining to Deku the truth of origins of his quirk. And Mirio would pretty much end up telling Deku that, he's sorry he might have taken things a bit too far. He would say that he hopes he can keep the secret, and Izuku would say, of course I'm going to keep the secret. He's Uncle All Might, for crying out loud. He would then tell Mirio that he's happy that somebody who's going to be able to use that quirk incredibly well was the person who got it. Though he would look at All Might and say, it would have been a better idea to give it to a quirkless kid, don't you think? Instead of making a already existing hero stronger, you should have made it so that we could have an extra hero. All Might, hearing that, would think that maybe that was a good point, but Deku, looking to All Might, would say that ultimately he's pretty glad that he gave it to him. As with that being the case, Deku would be told I am so scrambled up right now, that he needs to pick an internship. Ultimately, in this timeline, much like he's been doing for much of the story, he would end up interning with David's shield, not actually going with Mirio in this timeline, which is actually going to be affecting the overhaul arc in a pretty decent way. Because with Deku's non-presence there, that means that we don't get the Deku and Tsunade encounter, and Deku is most definitely not going to be there for the Hero Patrol to happen. So this leads us with two options. Option one, either Mirio would still end up going on a hero patrol, which I actually am not too sure if I think could actually still happen, considering two things. One, I'm pretty sure Mirio only did that because Deku was there, and two, the only reason that situation escalated as far as it did was because of Deku's presence. However, if that still does end up happening and Mirio does go on the hero patrol, then I could actually see him stopping Overhaul right there because of the sheer fact that he's a perfect counter to Overhaul, and seeing this scared little girl, Mirio, who now is literally the successor of the symbol of peace, just couldn't live with himself if he let that little girl go away. So he either stops him there, or second option, he never goes during that little pro hero little what's the word I'm looking for? I literally just said it. Oh yeah, the Pro Hero Patrol. And that means that instead, he would actually save Eri during the raid. However, for him in this situation, he wouldn't know about the existence of Eri. So mauling through multiple of the villains there and helping in the efforts to defeat Overhaul, they would end up finally finding themselves where Overhaul is matched up against Mirio. And regardless of how you want to slice this fight, Mirio is literally a hard counter to Overhaul. I don't even want to get into like power scaling stuff, but just think about it. Mirio, with his body being a third year, is much stronger than Izuku, and if you even watch the series, you can realize that Mirio's quirk isn't strength based, but the dude is a monster physically speaking. So there's just no way I don't see Mirio being able to access at least 70% of One For All, and that's more than enough to put him with the potential prime All Might, with the ability to pretty much permutate through things or just phase through them. Which, speaking of Mirio's quirk, I recently did a what if Naruto with a phase jutsu where I pretty much gave him Mirio's quirk. I'm not gonna lie. But regardless of that, go watch that video after you're done with this one. You know what I'm saying? Just a shameless plug. But yeah, no, either that happens or we could actually get a situation that could be devastating, which is where Overhaul would leverage Eri and pretty much shoot a quirk destruction bullet at her, knowing that Mirio would get in the way. And then in that moment, Mirio would probably get killed and Eri, and Overhaul gets away with her. But I just don't see Mirio being like slow enough to let that happen in this timeline, because we've already seen Deku, when he fought against Lady Nagant, run faster than a bullet. And that was with Fajin, obviously, but he doesn't have access to as much of One For All as Mirio does. So I could actually see Mirio saving the day in this timeline, and the actual Overhaul arc itself actually would go better than in the canon, with less actual destruction, because we don't get that massive kaiju version of Overhaul versus Izuku with Eri, using her time quirk on him. That said, as that entire arc was taking place, I could actually see Izuku making upgrades to his armor and essentially creating like a little watch, because obviously he doesn't have the arc reactor in his chest because he doesn't need it. But having this watch that Deku now going to be having that's indestructible, mind you, he could tap on it and pretty much turn the dial of the time to essentially make his armor pop up, just like in the movie where he like taps on his chest and the armor just comes out looking so sick. But yeah, no, I digress. With that being the case, I can see the students returning back to school and us kind of seemingly skipping the overhaul arc. We're actually going to be jumping straight into the school festival stuff, which, I mean, with the events of Eri happening and stuff like that, and the students, you know, still having the loss of Ida being a thing, I can see in this timeline that the school still has the festival, and Izuku, knowing the fact that this means so much to Eri, would actually use a lot of his robots, having heard about what happened with her and how Mirio saved her, to use them to actually make Eri her own little small gauntlet blaster, which she thinks is super cool. I could also see the robots being part of the festival, with the Iron Man suits actually helping with the whole like light show and stuff like that, shooting a bunch of blasts in the air and also using some to patrol the festival, which means that with that being said, there's just no world in which this dude who had the ability to pretty much like make things stretchy, what was his name? Gentle Criminal, right, Gentle Criminal. With Gentle Criminal arriving, I can see the armor suits actually stopping him, so we actually get a fully like just hilarious school festival with like the armors like dancing in the crowd and stuff like that, and everybody just having a grand old time. With that being the case, the next rare arc that would come around, or technically the next 3 arcs or last remaining arcs, would consist of the joint training arc, which happens in season 6, I believe, if I'm not wrong, the internship arc with Endeavor, where Bakugo, Todoroki, and Deku normally go, and last but not least, the Infinity War. I'm totally kidding. But yeah, no, the Endgame War arc, where Shigaraki gets all like the really cool like upgrades to him, and he ends up having the My Villain Academia stuff happen, and then we get like the Hojiki hospital incident where like the war would begin. That's pretty cool. Normally I never get to this part in the story, which is interesting, but regardless, what ends up happening in this timeline is that during the events of the actual joint training arc, it would be consisting of Deku, Mineta, I believe it was, Mina Ashido, and Uraraka against Monoma, the girl who could like pretty much has Buggy's devil fruit, the dude who can like make solid air solid, I believe it was. He's like a little fat short kid. And then there's like the other person who has like a mask, kind of has like that Todoroki look going on, but like with white hair and like a really ugly drip. And then obviously Shinso. But regardless, once the event would begin, this would actually happen in one of 2 ways. Option 1, the students would go through with the plan that Deku would create to try to defeat the other team, or option B, Deku would actually end up giving them their own Iron Man suits, which essentially allows them to like play heroes and are able to use like that stuff. But I don't want to have that happen, considering that if everybody gets an Iron Man suit, then we kind of have like a moment where if everyone's super, no one is. Like if everybody has access to Deku's power plus a quirk, then they're just better than him, right? But yeah, what ends up happening is that Deku would create a plan, and using this plan, they would pretty much create a ton of rubble and destruction stuff to actually lead the class into a trap. And once they funnel them there, Uraraka would go release, dropping a ton of rubble on the students, which ultimately Mineta would use to then capture them all in one spot using his grape brush technique to throw a bunch of his balls on his head, and Deku, using his armor, would create a black whip-like tendril to shoot at them and restrain each and every single one of them. It'd be at this point that Deku, noticing that only 4 people were there, would end up hearing his own voice from the distance saying, "Did we capture them all?" Uraraka would say, "Yeah." Mina would say, "We did it, yes." And Mina would say, "You're so cool, Izuku, of course we did." With that said, all 3 of his teammates would immediately fall under Shinso's mind control, and Deku, turning towards Shinso, would say, "We meet again." As using his little text of speech, he would say that that's a pretty cool usage of his quirk to pretty much change his voice to trick his teammates to answering his questions. He would tell him that that was a pretty cool showing, but it ends here, as Shinso, using his scarf, would maneuver during the area, trying to get away and catch Deku off guard, but Deku's speed and new armor were just too much for Shinso. One energy blast towards the direction of him would completely have him knocked out, and with that being the case, Deku would tie him up, ultimately tying up the rest of them, leading to that team being the winner, with round 5 going to Class 1A. With that being the case, we would then end up getting the whole little Endeavor agency arc, in which in this timeline I still actually see happening, but obviously Deku doesn't have One For All. Instead, he uses the armor. And the reason that this would happen is just due to the fact that A, Deku is still yet to actually go to an internship, so this time Nezu would deny his request, and B, being decent enough friends with Todoroki, Deku, you know, wondering who he should go intern with, Todoroki would say, why don't you come with my dad? He is the #1 hero after all, and he could teach you the most. So Deku would end up going with them, and we end up getting the whole little Endeavor, the Hawk stuff happening, the Ryukyu agency and the Oki Mariner crew versus the smugglers and stuff like that, and then like the whole ending where Endeavor's son gets attacked by a villain, where Endeavor saves him, and class like the 3 students show off how incredibly far along they are in their training. Which, speaking of, during this arc, they're all second years, right? Because they finished their first year prior to the Forest Training Camp arc, and then in this section of the story, they're all like second year students, if I'm not mistaken. Regardless though of what year they are, eventually a couple of months would pass, and this would finally lead us to the events of the war arc starting. This is when like the heroes would go off and pretty much try to like stop All For One and Dr. Ujiko and all that whole situation from taking place. And with that happening and the villains pretty much all starting to be taken down, the whole situation where like the arc would begin and Shigaraki would wake up and ultimately kill tons of heroes and become a massive threat would start. The war arc would be insane, but it just doesn't have the same, like, it just doesn't have the same stakes as the one in the original. The only reason that it feels as dire as it does is because of the deaths and how incredibly overpowered Shigaraki is due to the nature of his decay quirk. The dude could atomize you by simply touching you, like you're turned to straight up dust. He has a perfect counter, which is why in my head I've always thought that honestly, Mirio should have been the one to get One For All. Just because of the fact that, dude, Mirio is the perfect living counter to the decay quirk, which is arguably Shigaraki's most powerful quirk. So ultimately, I just don't know if I see any world at all in which Shigaraki and a Mirio fight doesn't happen. And I know that the story is Iron Man Deku, so I probably shouldn't cover this, but I still want to cover this. The second that Mirio would arrive to the battlefield, he would face off against Shigaraki, who immediately touching the ground would say, "Just try to stop me, you hero," as a bunch of Mirio's allies would disintegrate before him. In this moment, Mirio would grit his teeth as from the bottom of his heart, he would scream, "One for all, 100%, come flying in towards the direction of Shigaraki and landing a thunderous punch, which breaks his neck and sends him into the air. After this would happen, Mirio jumps up, like coming after him, as Shigaraki, using multiple quirks, would snap his neck back into the place, as black tendrils shooting out from Shigaraki would try to grab onto Mirio, all completely missing, as Mirio, pretty much flying through the air, would end up telling Shigaraki that this ends now. Punch, 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 over and over and over and over, eventually leading to Shigaraki in the air being absolutely pummeled. Him realizing that he could straight up die, would end up panicking and would start shooting all the quirks that he has at his disposal, not thinking straight, because at the moment Mirio was pressuring him so hard, like in Clash Royale, whenever, you know, an opponent is dropping a Mega Knight, a Witch, Skeleton Army, a Golem, a P.E.K.K.A. all at the same time. Meanwhile, I only have 3 elixir. That's how much pressure is currently being put on one lane. And Mirio is just going nuts. Like, he's going bananas right now, just destroying Shigaraki. Ultimately, the fight would be a complete one-sided stomp, with Shigaraki pulling out all the stops, and yes, I can actually see him maybe hitting Mirio once or twice, but because of the fact that he could phase through most of these attacks, almost nothing that Shigaraki tried to do quirk-wise actually ended up working. He wasn't able to keep Mirio off of him, and the pummeling just got worse and worse. Shigaraki was just a villain that had to die, so eventually, Mirio ends up landing a powerful smash that literally would send Shigaraki flying into space. Like, it's such a hard punch that boom, like the air coming off of it would send this man into space, into orbit, where ultimately, without having some sort of breathing in space quirk, which I don't think exists, he would end up literally just suffocating. Imagine that's the quirk that Deku had. He had a quirk that lets him breathe in space, but he just didn't know about it because, like, I mean, how are you going to find that out? Jokes aside though, what ends up happening after this is that on Deku's side of things, using a bunch of the armors that he would have used, Deku would probably be tasked with facing off against Gigantomachia. And with that fight happening, I can see one final scene in which Deku using the Hulkbuster suit would essentially end up facing off against Gigantomachia as the two fists would clash and boom, like wind would shoot off of it as all the people around would be like, run, run, run. But it'd be in this moment that a bunch of Iron Man suits come flying in and start blasting Gigantomachia from different angles. All the while that's happening, Deku's facing off against him in a 1v1 clash battle as the both of them would be going forth, battling it out like two absolute tanks. Eventually, this would lead to the point where all of Izuku's armored suits in the air would all shoot a concentrated, powerful blast at the direction of Gigantomachia, which ultimately caused him to be weakened, and the rest of Class 1A jumping in with Meta Knight using her little gas to try to weaken him as well. You got Kaminari shooting lightning at him, you know, Mina Ashido shooting acid. They're all just rushing at this dude, and then Mount Lady even comes in and punches Gigantomachia. They're able to essentially use everything in their power to ultimately restrain him and knock the dude clean out. And that, ladies and gentlemen, would mark the ending of What If Deku was Iron Man. I really do hope that you guys ended up loving my interpretation of this, because a couple of years ago, before I was a YouTuber, I watched a series called What If Deku was Iron Man by a creator named Sir Plots-A-Lot. And let me just tell you guys, the series was absolutely immaculate. The character writing, the moments, it's just incredible to see what some content creators can do out there who have fresh ideas different than mine and their own separate takes and their own like different agendas. It was such an incredible series, but the only thing that kind of like rubbed me off the wrong way was the fact that it never finished. But hey, most What If creators never finish their videos, so, and including me actually, like I have a ton of videos that I haven't finished, which, speaking of unfinished videos, I'm completely shocked and taken aback that nobody has had the idea yet to commission me to actually finish an unfinished video. Like, there's so many people that have been commissioning videos lately that, like, thank you, but I'm stunned that not one of them has ever had like a video that is like, oh, I really wish it was done, and they had the thought, oh, now that I could commission it, he has to finish the video. Like, that's honestly what I would do if I was you guys. But I digress. That aside, that is going to be marking the end of the video. I know I already said that, but leave your comments down below in the comment section. Let me know what you guys thought about this series. Also, in case you guys are craving more What If Deku was Iron Man, you can go check out Izukage's interpretation of this. I know he's been gone for a while, and a lot of you guys ask me about him all the time in the comment section. What happened to Izukage? But he's doing fine. Trust, he's just in college, living a normal life now. But yeah, go check out What If Deku was Iron Man on Izukage's page. It's an incredible video just like this one. But with all that out of the way, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much to my boy Aquafina who commissioned this video. Shout out to all you guys who have been watching this, and thank you guys so much for those of you who have been commenting recently on all of my videos. It genuinely means the world when I see specific people of you guys who have like a purple like thing on your comments, on your name by your comment. That tells me that you guys are the most active commenters on the channel. So shout out to you guys, and also the people who have the red little emo on the YouTube thing. Y'all also comment a lot. The rest of y'all got some catching up to do. But regardless, leave a like on the video, seeing as it helps to do way better in the algorithm. And it has been your boy Xehther, and I am out. Peace.
Hey, you made it to the end of the video. Like it or die! That wasn't the line, Kachan! Whatever!
And after that would happen, we would end up actually getting the whole little mall incident, in which in the original, remember, Shigaraki ends up having that encounter with Izuku. Originally it happens because of his anger with Stain and how everything's been going down. But remember, in this timeline, things are a lot different, considering that Stain never goes public in terms of the message that he was spreading. He simply got out there as somebody who killed a hero student, and a lot of people wouldn't actually sympathize with him. So I just don't see Shigaraki coming to the mall and trying to talk with Izuku. In fact, because of that, I don't even know if I can even see many of the people who joined the League of Villains doing so. But because I want to keep the story going and I don't want to have to deal with the ramifications that not having them there is going to have, we're going to be saying that they still end up joining the League of Villains, with Stain being a non-official member who will join the organization, but for different reasons, obviously. That said, with this being the case, the students would all eventually make their way towards the Forge training camp, and as soon as they would arrive, they would be told the truth about it, with Mandalay creating a bunch of golems out of mud and them having to face off against all of them, ultimately making their way towards the actual training grounds. It'd be on this day that Deku's biggest weakness would finally come to light. The fact that his suit isn't exactly portable. His suit actually ended up being left on the bus, so that means that in this section we actually get an embarrassing moment where Deku kind of is holding the class back. Everyone would be like, "Where's your suit?" And Deku's like, "I don't have it on me." This would lead Deku to discovering that one little weakness that he has, the fact that he's not able to just always have it on him at all times. So here's where the idea of making the suit actually fly to him via like a watch or like a command that he could use to actually get the suit to always come to him, which is pretty sick. And it's what ended up leading us to the whole scene that Iron Man has where the suit like flies at him and it actually like injures him. I can see that still happening with Izuku trying to kink that out, obviously later on down the road, but regardless, during the Forest training camp, Deku would essentially use most of his time trying to find some new fighting moves, working with one of the Wild Wild Pussycat members who could help him with combat training, and also, you know, shooting at a bunch of trees, using Todoroki's quirk to freeze them so that they don't cause a forest fire. That said, that's pretty much how the Forest training camp would go until finally the Vanguard Action Squad would arrive.